Well, good evening, folks. It is 6 o'clock, and it is Tuesday, October 11th, 2022. We are in the council chambers in the city of Platteville, and I am calling the regular meeting of the Common Council to order. Candace, we'll start with roll call.
Ken Killian.
Here.
Eileen Nichols.
Here.
Kathy Kopp.
Here.
Jason Arts.
Here.
Lynn Parrott.
Here.
Todd Casper.
Here.
Barbara Doss.
Here. The first thing on our agenda is the consideration of the consent agenda. If you want action on anything, separate action on anything, please let me know. In the packet, we had council minutes from September 27th, our regular meeting. There's payment of bills. We have the financial report for September. I have no appointments for boards or commissions tonight. We have licenses, 1 and 2 year operator licenses to serve and sell and serve alcohol is in your packet. Permits tonight, we have a banner permit for the Platteville School District to be hung from October 24th to November 9th. And we have a street closing permit for Main Street from Chestnut to Oak and Bonson from Main to Irving on Saturday, October 29th from 10 to 1 for the annual Sweet Treats on Main, sponsored by the Platteville Main Street Program.
Motion to approve the consent calendar?
Second to the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda as presented. Candace will vote.
Killian.
Yes.
Nichols. Kopp.
Yes.
Arts.
Yes.
Parrott.
Yes.
Casper.
Yes.
Doss.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Sorry. Next on our agenda is our citizens' comments, observations, and petitions, if any. I have nobody that's registered to speak on anything that is something other than an agenda item. So, but I do believe there are a couple of staff members who have. Before we start that, I was at the fire department last night for the open house. Seemed like kids were having a very good time, and I saw our chief with the new chief. Would you say he was the new chief, Ryan? He was trying. He was about knee high, but he came with his little radio, and he came with his little helmet, and he came with his little axe and his little pry bar. He had it all. He was ready. So I think we have a replacement for Ryan. We'll call this little boy in waiting, okay? Because he's really into it. So thanks to the fire department for their open house.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick announcements. So we had the Taste of Platteville event on Sunday. So definitely want to give a big thanks to not only Platteville Main Street, the Chamber of Commerce, all of the city staff that was involved in kind of putting that together, the Platteville Area Pickleball Association. We ended up having about 200 voting submissions. So our goal was hoping to get about 200 people to show up. We're pretty confident we hit more than that because we saw a decent amount of people there. So the information we saw is it was pretty well received. So we're going to be looking at trying to find out how we can tweak that and do that again. That was kind of the first event from the Platteville Economic Development Partners. So we're excited about that. We announced the 3 winners today. That just went out on Facebook. So Jody did a great job in kind of recording my long-winded speech. So that's out there for the winners. But then in kind of conjunction with that, one of the things that you're going to start seeing now, obviously, is with the pickleball courts. That has been kind of a question, has been what's going on there. As everyone remembers, there are some corrective actions that need to be taken place in order to ensure that they are tournament level specified. That was something that was not completed within the project. So that actually is going to be starting tomorrow. So the first thing that's going to be noticed is the fences will be coming down. And then essentially what they're going to be doing, if weather permits, is they're going to be milling off about 1.5 inches of the asphalt, then trying to make any kind of the improvements that they need to make so that it can be level and up to specifications. They do hope to try to have that repaving done by the end of this year. And then potentially in spring, they would be coming back then and redoing all of the fences, fixing all that, and then kind of putting on the layer of paint and everything else to get it to where it needs to be. So that deadline is they have till July of 2023 to complete that, but essentially they're going to be starting that project tomorrow. If you did also notice as well, the parking lot next to the pickleball courts is also being redone. That's part of the 2nd Street sidewalk and parking improvements. So they actually started that today. And I believe the inclusive playground just started doing concrete work So you'll notice that as well.
Does anybody have any other projects they want to report on? I have driven on Gridley and Hickory, and I have to say it's a vast improvement. And I would implore anybody who thinks they're going to go west on Main Street to know that you're not going to go west on Main Street unless you want to be in a big hole. Such a big hole that the backhoe today, when he went in the hole, you couldn't see him. So it's a big hole. All right, folks, let's move on then to the reports that were in your packet. Boards, commission, and committee minutes. Water and Sewer Commission, anything to add?
No addition for my part.
And Howard, how is the sewer the water sewer, or I guess it's just a sewer project, at the university going?
The pipeline portion is complete, and so now all they're doing is the restoration work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Housing Authority Board, Eileen? Okay, there were other reports in your packet, the Water and Sewer Financial Report, the Airport Financial Report, a report from the Tide Committee. Anything particular?
Nope.
Okay, and the Department Progress Reports. Anybody with questions on any of the Department Progress Reports? Okay, then let's move on to the action portion of our agenda. The first action item is Ordinance 2205, amending the official traffic map, no parking on Southwest Road. Howard?
Yes, thank you. The area on Southwest Road between Pioneer Road and the bridge does not have curb and gutter that we could paint yellow. This fall, people park perpendicular to the road in the grass between Pioneer Road and the bridge, causing sight distance problems for vehicles at Pioneer Road looking to pull out onto Southwest Road. Once identified by the police department, our staff posted it as temporary no parking pending an official change. Based on what was discussed last time, we reviewed the area on the north side. The bank is very steep, and even if someone does park there, it doesn't interfere with sight distance for people on Pioneer Road. So at this point, staff is recommending the ordinance as presented for the south side of the road. We will absorb the cost of the signs in the street division sign budget, and staff recommends approval of the attached ordinance.
Okay, anybody with questions on this ordinance restricting parking on Southwest Road? This would be the south side of Southwest Road from Pioneer Road to the bridge.
How many signs will you place, and how close will you place the signs to the asphalt roadway?
Our intention is to place one sign that would say no parking corner to here, so that anyone looking at that would understand that there's no parking from the corner of Pioneer Road to the sign, and we would put it standard distance, a couple of feet off of the asphalt, close to the bridge supports, the bridge guardrail.
I did see that there was temporary signage there. Has there been parking there during the time that the temporary signage has been up?
That I don't know. I don't know if the police department has seen anything either.
Okay.
Is the intention to eventually put curb and gutter along this corner, or is that too far in the future?
That would be way in the future at this point.
Where does the city limits end?
The city limits ends on the other side of the Alliant Energy substation.
Any other questions? Do I hear anybody proposing action?
I'll move to approve ordinance 2205, amending the official traffic map to install no parking here to corner sign on Southwest Road between Pioneer Road and the bridge.
Okay, we have a motion by Kathy and a second by Lynn to approve ordinance 2205. Candace will vote.
Killian,
Yes,
Nichols. Cop,
Yes.
Arts,
Yes.
Parrot,
Yes.
Casper,
Yes.
Doss.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, next on our agenda are the DNR stewardship grants. I guess there were two, so it is a plural. Howard.
Yes, thank you. We had Resolution 2209 authorizing the city manager to submit to the Department of Natural Resources applications for Mound View Park Trail and Main Street Trail connection projects. The Mound View Park Trail would be the one that goes from the existing PCA trail by the Jane N. Stone Bridge up that gravel pathway to Fairfield Drive through Mound View Park and up to Fairfield Drive. The Main Street trail connection would be the one basically from the dog park along the railroad bed up to the skate park and connection to East Main Street, east of the museums. Back in August, we received notification from the DNR that both had been tentatively selected for grant funding. There were 129 applications statewide requesting more than $30 million in grant assistance. It does indicate that if the city decides it is no longer interested in these grants, to let DNR know as soon as possible. There is a hard deadline of October 14th, this Friday. Staff and citizens met with DOT and DNR representatives on September 29th to discuss options. There's a note that when we talked with the DOT, our similar requests for DOT funding, they scored very well, but were too large. DNR reiterated that October 14th is a hard deadline. It was the consensus of the citizen group to recommend that the city decline the grant offer. And then this report was written prior to the technical advisor meeting with us on Friday, October 7th, to review options. Essentially, what the DNR representative said is that for the trail project itself, that the roaster pile can be separated, roaster pile remediation can be separated from the trail project if we wish to do so. The only thing that we would need to do is if we needed to dig up or dispose of any existing contamination on the pathway itself, we would have to properly manage that material. Put it in a landfill or put it into a roaster pile or something like that properly, but it does not have, we do not have to do a full restoration as part of the DNR project. So
Bob Hunthausen is here, and he has asked to speak for informational purposes. So Bob?
Yeah, Bob Hundhausen, 1043 Woodland Road, Platteville. I'm here tonight speaking for Platteville Community Arboretum. I was greatly appreciative of being invited down to Madison with city staff members and members of Inspiring Community and also other PCA members. last time I was here, I was encouraging the city council to vote to accept the DNR grant. But after our group went down to Madison, we learned that our timeline on collecting additional funds and fundraising was pretty narrow. We also learned a lot about the possibility of strengthening our grant requests for the next cycle. Contradictory to what I recommended last time, I'm here tonight to encourage the council to vote against accepting the DNR grant, unfortunately. But I think we learned quite a bit at our trip down to Madison to really make a good showing for the next cycle. So.
Thanks, Bob. And I think I was on that trip, and one of our big questions was the roaster pile, and so the person who came last Friday was actually a technical specialist on those kinds of things, and so I think he has some other recommendations and some ideas of where we might look for some money to do some remediation work, and so that will be separate from any of the rest of this stuff, so I would see that we would work through that. My understanding is that he was returning to Madison to see if he could find papers that documented what was to be done, and my understanding, Howard, is that you are also searching our archives for papers that detail what was to have been done, so that we have a starting point.
Correct.
All right. Well, good. All right. So you have heard from Howard and you have heard from Bob. The recommendation now is to decline, or to, I guess, decline this grant. Basically, because there's not enough time to do anything to raise money for it. So, other questions?
I would like to make a comment that I'm very appreciative of the efforts by not only the city staff, which were considerable, but also Inspiring Community and the Platteville Community Arboretum. I feel that they did a really good job with due diligence, doing whatever they could to see if they could make it happen. So.
I move to decline, can I say regretfully, the
Sure.
DNR grant awards for the Mountain View Park Trail and the Main Street Trail Connection projects.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion to decline the DNR grant awards, and I assume that means to also advise DNR of that decision in a timely manner. Candace will vote.
Killian,
Yes,
Nichols,
Yes.
Cop,
Yes.
Arts,
Yes.
Parrot,
Yes.
Casper,
Yes.
Doss.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, next up on our agenda is the Platteville Armory acquisition opportunity. Adam.
Yes. So as we've been discussing, the Platteville Armory was built between 1940 and 1942, utilizing a $32,000 bond issue approved referendum. The referendum passed with the understanding that the National Guard would be responsible for making rent payments to offset the borrowing. The finalized budget for the original project was $100,000, with the remaining funds being covered by the Works Progress Administration funds. Around 1985, the Platteville Armory was officially sold to the Wisconsin Department of Military Affairs for $50,000. Due to the community's contribution to the armory construction, the city of Platteville has long had an agreement with the Wisconsin Department of Military Affairs to use the facility for a variety of community activities. Most notably, the hardwood drill floor is used by the city recreation department for basketball leagues, karate classes, and other sports. The armory has also been a city voting site and used by its police department for training. The building contains the main drill floor gymnasium, offices, kitchen, restroom, locker rooms, and storage space. The approximate area for each floor is as follows. The first floor is 10,225 square feet. The basement is 9,900 square feet. The second floor is 3,125 square feet. And the third floor is 593 square feet. The first floor is handicap accessible, but the other floor levels are not. The basement level does have access to grade via an overhead door. So since becoming the city manager, I obviously have been made aware by staff and council members of conversations over the years regarding the Wisconsin Department of Military Affairs' desire to sell the property. I think the last one we had was about 2018, where we were looking to do a request for proposals, and then most recently would have been 2021. Before the DMA can list the property on Wisconsin surplus for a private entity to purchase, they are required to reach out to the city of Platteville to determine if the city is interested in acquiring the building. If the city doesn't wish to gain ownership, then DMA would then sell the property to a private party. So during initial discussions with the DMA in December of 2021 and again in May of 2022, the city pursued a potential transfer like the $1 transactional transfer done with the Platteville School District for the OE Gray Learning Center property. Unfortunately, staff was made aware during the summer of 2022 by DMA representatives that they were not able to get authorization to transfer the property to the city for that amount. So during discussions with the DMA regarding the city of Platteville purchasing or gaining ownership of the property, 3 scenarios were reviewed in greater detail. The first one is a land swap with the city for the appraised value of the property. The DMA is looking for about 20 acres of land, which would be utilized in the future for the creation of a new armory to be built within the next 7 to 10 years. Due to the only land of this size being located within our industrial park, this scenario would not be recommended to be considered further by city staff. Option 2 would be the outright purchase at agreed upon price. So the DMA originally was looking for a purchase price of $320,000 based on an appraisal conducted during April of 2022. During discussions with city staff and the Common Council, it was noted that the appraisal was made on the extraordinary assumption that no adverse environmental conditions existed on the subject property, and the reliance on an extraordinary assumption may impact the results of the appraisal assignment. DMA provided the city with documentation of lead testing conducted in 2018, 2019, 2021, and 2022, in which the 2022 test results did show 2 areas within the former firing range floor located in the basement of the armory, which did not meet the acceptable testing requirements. They have since remediated those issues that they've done in the past. The DMA has also been able to provide information to the city that Wisconsin Asbestos Management System is tracking materials in the 12-inch white and brown tiles and mastic, which makes up approximately 5,300 square feet of the facility. Due to these factors, the DMA leadership approved a proposed reduction of the armory to the city of Platteville for $170,000. The reduction considered an approximate reduction cost of $150,000 for lead mitigation based on their 38 past lead mitigation projects. Upon review by city staff and after pending council approval and a due diligence period to review all mitigation efforts needed, was made to DMA for $100,000 with a pending closing date of January 2023. This offer would have required official approval by the Common Council in open session to allow for the community, obviously, to weigh in. The DMA responded indicating they will not take less than $135,000 and required a closing date of November 1st, 2022. They have since changed that now. They are still sticking to the $135,000 number, but they are open to negotiating, obviously, a later closing date since we're already in the month of October. So potentially they would be willing to look at agreeing to either a January 2023 or potentially going back with some other consideration that potentially the council could propose. So if the city were to purchase the property, obviously discussion would need to be had about how to officially run and operate the facility. So option 1 would obviously be complete control of the property. This facility would become a recreation center for the community, and in future years, the city would be looking to move all park and recreation offices and operations to the site. This would include moving the Parks Department to the bottom floor, recreation staff to the building, and potentially rental utilization of the second floor splays. The Platteville Senior Center obviously would be another recreation entity to consider, moving either temporarily or permanently to the Armory of Purchase. The Common Council and city staff have made the decision to move the fire station to the site currently occupied by OE Gray Learning Center. This will require the determination of another location for the Platteville Senior Center. Obviously, currently, the discussions regarding the new fire station have included the creation of a large meeting room space that could occupy as many as 60 to 100 participants along with a commercial kitchen. This space could eventually be utilized by the senior center, but obviously a temporary location will need to be utilized until construction is finished. The Platteville Armory does have a commercial kitchen on the first floor, which could be utilized by the Grant County Aging and Disability Resource Center for their meal programs in the interim. The first floor does have handicap accessibility, and the office space is currently being utilized by the Armory Recruiter could house the senior center temporarily. Further conversations about how the Armory could become the official location of the senior center would need to be discussed and planned. Obviously, when we toured it, there were questions about the bathrooms, and there was obviously questions about the space and utilization. So if that would be something, that obviously is something that would need to be discussed further and kind of planned out. The main positive, obviously, to this option is the city has control of the property and can continue to run park and recreation activities without interruptions. The negative is the added cost of having to purchase the property and, again, the continual maintenance and upkeep of the facility. Option 2, then, would be a request proposal for sales of the Armory to a private entity with the requirement that the city would have the utilization of the first floor space for recreational purposes, potential senior center space utilization, and access to the kitchen. The remaining floors would be able to be utilized by private entities, and funding assistance for maintenance and upkeep of the facility would obviously be an ongoing conversation. This option would allow the city to recoup the cost of having to purchase the facility. This option also would have the property added back to the property tax roll so long as it was sold to a private entity. It also would allow the city to continue to run our park and recreation activities with limited disruptions to the community. And then option 3, obviously, would be to decline to purchase the property and allow the DMA to list the property on Wisconsin surplus. The city has no control, obviously, then over the future ownership of the property. And if the city is no longer able to utilize the property for recreation purposes, then potentially the city could see a cost increase to budget to cover new rent space for recreational programming, or a loss of revenue for programs that can no longer occur due to space needs. And we're currently already seeing that now, because we obviously have been practicing with the fact that if we didn't have the Armory, what would that mean for our recreation? Currently, we're utilizing space, obviously, in OE Gray with their small gym, and then looking to the availability of any school buildings or potential gym space. The downfall with that is we've had to obviously limit our numbers or look at even potentially canceling because we just don't have the space. So that's something that we can look at, and that kind of falls on the last part here. The community could see a reduction of program offerings or reduced capacity limits due to space limitations. Council members and city staff were obviously able to gain full access to the Armory building on Wednesday, October 5th. So we had both, it was Director Crowfoot and Director Lowe and myself, along with a couple of council members, we were able to tour the building. We were able to see the space, and obviously there are pros and cons. Some of the pros are definitely the recreation space that is available. The cons really kind of add up again to the age of the building. When you look at the bathrooms, this was built in 1940, and at that point in time, they had different philosophies in space and bathrooms. So those are things that, with taking this on, we would have to long-term consider about updates that would need to be made in regards to making things ADA compliant, and looking at specifically with the ADA ramps that are already out there. Those are all things that we would need to consider. So that kind of falls into the budget and fiscal impact. So obviously it's unclear at this time what the actual cost of operating the facility would be. Staff have estimated the cost could be between $25,000 and $35,000 for utility costs. Without a guaranteed revenue stream dedicated to offsetting utility expenses, this cost would have to be covered within the reserve funding of the city and then obviously added to the operational budget going forward. Another concern would be the staffing requirements it would take to maintain another building within city operations. Currently, most of our municipal buildings fall under the operations of our building maintenance specialists. I want to make it very clear, I believe Shannon Butson is an amazing asset to our organization, but I do worry about running him ragged with the addition of another building. So since becoming the city manager in 2020, I've started to review long-term planning changes which would benefit us. As we continue to grow as a city, the need to create a facility management department is evident to streamline operations. I do feel already that there is a need to create another position to assist the building maintenance specialists, but if the city were to take on the Platteville Armory, it would need to determine the additional staffing needed. The cost of creating another position at this time is unknown, but an estimate would be between $70,000 to $80,000 when including benefits for full-time, and roughly $30,000 to $60,000 when considering part-time. So the estimated budgetary impact to take on the Platteville Armory would be estimated right now at the following. There would be the purchase of the property for $135,000. Utility expenses would be budgeted at $35,000 in comparison to some of our other buildings. There would be the insurance cost increase, obviously, for the property, having to insure the property going forward, and the maintenance of the property at $10,000. Staff wages and benefits potentially would be $80,000. This could be discussed regarding potential part-time employees or no employees at all. Capital improvement long-term planning, we'd be looking at trying to budget about $10,000 a year to ensure that we can update the equipment as needed. So that brings the estimated total to about $275,000. And then potentially, if there would need to be mitigation costs, we have an estimate there anywhere between $50,000 and, as they kind of indicated, $150,000. So the Common Council can direct the staff to outright purchase the Armory property for the requested value of $135,000, or obviously a value of their choosing. Funding would be recommended by city staff to come from the following budgetary accounts. One of the things you would have to consider is the senior center building sales. If that's going to be the permanent location of the senior center and potential updates, there is funding available for that. If you're not going to use that, obviously then you have to come up with an additional money to cover that cost. So there's about $48,000 that has been put aside from the previous sale of the senior center that could be used towards updates or towards the purchase of this. That obviously is a council consideration. Potentially you could use park impact fees of $20,000. There could be ARPA funds that could be used. We've estimated about $66,000 for that to get you to the total purchase price of $135,000. Obviously, if the property is outright purchased by the city, then consideration needs to be made whether to have it become a city asset or whether it should be put back on the tax roll via request for proposal process. The Park and Recreation Department has expressed their desire to utilize the facility, and both Director Lowe and I have been contacted by business owners interested in purchasing of the property. Potentially, a requirement could be added to an RFP for a business owner to be able to purchase the Armory while giving the city access to the first floor gym, kitchen, and office spaces to continue recreational programming and future utilization by the Platteville Senior Center, either temporary or permanently if chosen. If this RFP option is desired by the Common Council, then city staff would recommend we look at entering a short-term borrowing of $135,000 with a local bank for the funding to be paid back by the RFP sale of property to a private entity. Another option that could be proposed to the Department of Military Affairs would be to determine if they would allow us to issue the RFP, and then once an approved buyer has been selected, the payment then would be made, thus not requiring the city to have to additionally borrow the funds. The Department of Military Affairs has provided an update that they are willing to accept a closing date, which could be proposed as of January 31st, 2023. So again, key advantages to having ownership of this facility would be the continued ability to operate recreational programming out of the facility. It could be either a permanent or temporary location for the Platteville Senior Center when the fire station project occurs, and lease space for potential small businesses or occupants currently within OE Gray. That could be the Elks Club, as well as Head Start could potentially go there as well. City staff also feels the RFP process is an avenue that should be explored to maximize the return on investment to the city and increase the tax base while allowing our park and recreation activities to continue in a familiar venue and forum. This would be the current proposed recommendation from staff if asked for a determination at this moment. City staff are looking for a recommendation from the council on how they would like to proceed. So there's obviously a lot of avenues and options that this discussion can go down. But essentially there really is kind of three that you can think of. One is you are outright purchasing it and you can determine what that price is. The Department of Military Affairs has put it at $135,000. You can accept that number. You can propose a different number. The other option then is we could have further conversations with the Department of Military Affairs about an RFP. If they would allow us to kind of delay that process and potentially then limit the financial exposure of the city. Or again, you can say that you would direct staff to not approve for this or not go down this direction. And then we would be giving basically the DMA the right to put the property on Wisconsin surplus. They've indicated they would start at about the $170,000 asking price. And then there's obviously other options and alternatives that are out there, but that's the rundown.
Okay, that was a long rundown. So, questions. Kathy, I'm going to just go down one by one and ask anybody if they have questions.
Yes, ma'am. A number of questions, actually. If a decision was be made to go back to Department of Military Affairs and ask them if it's possible to do an RFP more directly in keeping our city borrowing, the issue remains on financing the expenses. Is there a projected revenue that could be anticipated from that facility through recreational programming?
You want to take that
Yeah,
one?
Sure. I did a little bit of projected, and I did a worst-case scenario, one off by, and I shared this with Councilmember Lynn. Worst-case scenario on rentable square footage in the second floor. Rentable square footage was about 1,600 square feet, or about $7,800 per year. Now, I did all these on triple net, rentals, so that in fact, the city is not eating all the utility costs, so those costs would be shared. On the first floor, which of course is the nicer floor, there's a total of about 1,500, a little over 1,500, and at a worst-case scenario of 50 cents per square foot is about 9,000, a little over 9,000 per year. And then the bottom floor, which actually is a very nice, I think probably the easiest one to rent, especially at a reasonable rate of 25 cents per square foot, of 6,392 square foot, is about 19,000 per year. So a triple net rental, and this is real rough estimates, and I think on the real low end of about $36,168. That does not include the gym at all, which of course, having the gym is considerable cost savings, and more importantly, being able to put on the programs that Parks and Rec are accustomed to. So that gives you at least an idea.
Okay, another question, and this is dealing more with the senior center. For if the DMA was not in favor of doing an RFP.
Yep.
And we were looking at a direct purchase. What if the senior center, and I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth, but I've been going to the commission meetings. What if the senior center would choose not to go there? I mean, they currently pay rent for space where they're at.
Correct.
What if they would decide to take their rent money and go somewhere else? What would that have, what kind of an effect would that have on revenue for the building?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the long-term conversation with that is we're looking at this as a couple of options. Is number one right now, if we don't have the Platteville Armory, and the determination is made after we look at all of the concept plans for the fire station and we get everything finalized and we're looking at potentially breaking ground next year, the number one question becomes what happens then to the senior center? Where does it go? So that's where we have to look at this as potentially, if that's not a long-term solution where there's going to be money put into that to make it what it needs to be, then the benefit obviously of owning it is it's a temporary option. Because the three keys obviously is the Grant County ADRC program needs to have a commercial kitchen to be able to work out of. It has that. So there is the potential that if that needs to transfer temporarily until whether it's the fire station or there's consideration of other areas, whether it's the Brodsky Center or something else, that option is there. So I think the big thing is that it gives us options then to look at possible temporary places that they could go until either the new fire station is remodeled and the community room possibly becomes a possibility, or as you indicated, Kathy, maybe it's somewhere else. Because when that building goes down, there's not going to be rent then, obviously, that is going to be charged. So the fundraising that's being done to essentially offset, really, it's not really rent anymore because the city owns it. It's more utility offset or offset of the program. So that becomes the question is that, typically they've been doing about $15,000 in sales and in different fundraising. That potentially then could be used, as you kind of indicated, is that they look at somewhere else. We look at somewhere else. The other thing then, at least, and the offices that are in there, they're not ideal, but it's a space. So when we're talking about temporary space, it's an option. The gym space is there, so for any of the programs, at least from a temporary standpoint, it just gives us more options. That may mean that when we're looking at things, we may have to potentially have things in different spots where it may be, if it's I know they do yoga, I know they do different things, they do other things there. Maybe that is done in the gym portion of the Armory if we own it, or if we're using it for the RFP and then it's elsewhere. I think, as we said, the long-term considerations, if that truly is looked at to be a possible ending spot for the senior center, there's some things that need to be discussed. I mean, as we walk through it, it's bathrooms, it's space. There's not a lot of usable space. It is not easy, again, to get upstairs. There is no elevator. So those are some of the things that would have to be considered. It's not flat, whereas some of our other places are. So those are all the considerations that obviously would have to be occurred. I think it's a temporary option, for sure, when we're looking at that. If it's a future, there's a lot more conversation we're going to have about that. in regards to what that would mean. I know parking was a concern that was brought up, and it's legitimate. It's, it's a building that was built in the 40s, so it's not built to, the needs today. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be. That doesn't mean that in the future, maybe that's the starting point of, I hate to say it, but it's a huge, a remodel of that area to make it what it truly would benefit. But from all sides, I think as Bob indicated, there definitely is some benefits to having the ability for Park and Rec to be able to work in the basement area during the winter, where right now they're kind of working out of the pool maintenance shed. It's kind of a combination of the pool. It's not ideal. So those are things. The downfall, as we talked about, is cost. It's reality. It's increased cost and unknowns. Nobody knows what it's going to cost to. There's been mitigation that's been done, and typically that, and everything that Bob has been looking at, the DMA has dealt with that, but that would be something that if anybody wanted to use the basement, we'd have to look at that. As far as the upper floors, those have been handled, so that's not causing any issues. It's not causing any, long-term health concerns, but those are all things that you have to consider.
Okay, looking at the scenario of the RFP option.
Yep.
It's my understanding the city currently owns a big chunk of the parking lot.
Correct.
What would be proposed with that if this doesn't happen? I mean,
Yep.
we're gonna be sitting there with a parking lot that's basically landlocked with no building. Is that a possibility that it could be sold to whoever would purchase the armory that would benefit the city?
Yeah, you could absolutely include that in your RFP request. Remember the RFP request, you can dictate the terms of the RFP. So, yeah, you could include those lots.
And then my final point is, in the last couple of days, and I had a call just before coming here tonight, 3 individuals threw this new idea, and they said if the city is looking at purchasing the armory, they would prefer for the city to purchase it with the idea that it would be the location for the new fire station.
So if that,
I know,
Yep.
and I know how far down the road we've gone, but I just said that I will bring it up.
Yep.
But then the feedback on the other side is that they said what's going on at OE Gray then could be left and maybe expanded on for other things.
Yeah, so what I would reference, anybody that has questions about that, if you look at the actual study that was done in 2020, it indicates it looked at a couple of areas. It looked at the cost to purchase, essentially it's 3-acre parcel is what the new fire station looks at. And the 3 things they looked at was, okay, what happens if the city has to go out and buy 3 acres of land? Well, the downfall to that is you're paying the money for the new land, and then whatever that land is, you're now taking it off the tax roll. So that was an issue with purchasing any new property. When they looked at the armory, the number one concern that they had is in order to fit a new fire station on there, you're doing 3 stories. And that is not beneficial to, if you're building a fire station, you never want to go 3 stories. That's not realistic. That's too costly. You're talking elevators, you're talking everything else. That's why it ended up being OE Gray was the ideal location, because again, that property is already off the tax roll. So when the city purchased it, it had 0 impact on the assessed value, which we'll be talking about later, which is the number one thing that allows us as a city to determine, how we can fund our overall operations. So that's the number one concern with the armory. That's the reason that when they did that whole study and brought that forward, unfortunately, it doesn't fit the way it's shaped and the way it would be. The only way you could get a fire station is it'd be 3 stories, and that's not cost effective.
Jason, questions?
So kind of staying on the theme of the RFP version, if a private entity was to buy it and we were to use the first floor facilities, how would that work with like utilities and all of that? Would that be something that would have to be hashed out with the RFP, or?
Yeah, potentially you'd have to enter in some type of memorandum of understanding or an agreement that basically would allow us, it'd be no different than what we're doing right now. Is essentially we'd be entering into some type of a rental agreement with that particular buyer that says, okay, we are going to pay either X amount of rent, or we're going to put X amount of dollars aside that potentially goes to that business or individual that then is used for maintenance, general upkeep, et cetera. So that'd be something that would have to be negotiated between both parties.
And if, hypothetically, if the senior center was to go there, would all those costs then be on us if we wanted to remodel or do stuff with that space?
Yeah, I mean, anything, essentially, if we're asking for the access to the first floor, you could negotiate that, but I doubt that a private entity is going to say, sure, go nuts. There's going to have to be some understanding of that cost is going to be on the city. And then it also is going to have to be in agreement with that owner because they technically still are going to own it. So any kind of alterations or changes that we're making are going to have to be approved by the whoever is the person that, or entity that owns the property.
Do we have any estimates right now in terms of like if we were to make it fully accessible and to the point where it would work for the senior center, how much would that cost in terms of renovations? Do we have any idea right now?
No, because I think a lot of those conversations go into, okay, if we're going to do this right, you're talking, I think that's the question is do you do it right or do you do it just enough? And I think if we're truly going to take that on and that's going to become a recreation center or potentially a long-term, community center, whatever the term is, there's a lot of questions there as to if we're going to do it right. You're talking probably then all 3 floors need to be able to be accessible. So then you're talking an elevator, you're talking the cost of that. So that's some of the concerns is that, there's no question this has a lot of positives, but the negatives come down, it's again, cost. It's, and the downfall is when you're talking, the conversation goes to, well, then why don't you just build something new? Well, new, you're talking $5 to $10 million. So that's a big difference between, 135,000 plus improvements. So I think it's a step, but it's a lot of conversation that we would have to have. Is we'd have to look at what does that truly mean for the city? What are the wants? What are the needs? What are the space requirements? And can that be done? I mean, it's a big space. If you think about it, that parking lot is big.
Yeah.
So there is the potential that you could add on or you could completely do some type of remodel. But what is that? That's going to depend on, that's the question. Is that a referendum that needs to occur where we're going to have to get input from the community? Probably. So that's kind of the opportunity. Right now we're looking at how do we continue to run our operations as they currently stand? And does this give us some kind of fallback options if things occur? Absolutely. The downfall of that, again, is it's a cost-benefit analysis.
Do you know how much, if it went back on the tax rolls, how much the city would be getting?
That's going to depend on what they sell it for and what it appraises at. I mean, if you're talking, I'd have to run some numbers.
Okay.
But I mean, it definitely, anything that goes on the tax roll, if it's $170,000 and that's what it truly would be assessed at, you're probably, you're talking a couple $1,000 is tax there. So maybe 3, 4 without doing any true numbers in my head.
Sure. All right. Yeah, I think that's all I had for right now.
Eileen?
I toured the facility a number of years ago. I unfortunately wasn't available at the last tour, but would you say that structurally the building is sound? I know we're talking about what we would have to remodel
Yep.
to make it really work the best way for the city, but is the building itself sound?
Yes, there's no question that building is sound.
Okay.
So
For $135,000, we're getting a solid building.
you're getting a solid building. As we talked about, the concerns that obviously were noticed are going to be, was built in 1940, so it definitely is sound, but obviously it's the mechanical systems, it's everything else. Have they been maintained? Certainly. But is there going to be costs with anybody knows, you got an older house, older building, there's requirements. There's things that are going to have to be updated.
Yep, so we weigh those kinds of improvements to the value of the existing building if you were to build something
Yep.
new, let's say, or rent. If you have to find another facility to rent, whether it's just for recreation activities or for a senior center. So you also consider that.
Right.
when you look at the whole price of the building.
Correct.
And then the parking is an advantage, because if you have another site, there's always a question in Platteville of parking. So I think that's I like the idea of potentially selling it eventually to a private entity. But if we also decide that we can find a way to make it cash flow, that's not necessary. The other thing is, if we're talking about trying to find additional space for offices and for facilities to house recreation and parks, equipment, again, this offers that. So those are what I see as positives. Definitely there are negatives on, the cost of the remodeling, things like that, but again, on another building and you're gonna pay for remodeling there, it's the same thing. That's-
Ken?
Well, since the meeting last time, there are two things here that, to me, have come up. One, I haven't heard from what the senior center is thinking about it. Two of the people, I believe, toured the building the other week, and so I would like to hear what they're thinking about the possible use of the armory as far as for the senior center. So that's one aspect. Maybe there's been some change in their mind. So I assume you have a number of people that want to speak, is
Right,
that correct?
but I'm asking for questions first, yes, so
So
I
then-
have a couple to go through yet.
And then the other question I have is this thing as far as the fire station. I read for the fire station, they're beginning to design it. So as a council member, I basically have no clue as to what the design will be. And so, to me, I'd like to know what the design will be before I start, buying a fire station and asking the people to go into buying the armory and people going into the armory for the senior center. So I don't know what the fire station needs. Do you need OE Gray? Can OE Gray be kept there? And that answer you have not given. And so the comment made, you can't go higher than 3 stories for a fire station. Well, how much does that mean as far as space that you have for a fire station when you consider that whole space? Also on that space, we have 2 buildings, at least 2 that are dilapidated, and they could be used for fire station space also as well. And so that's another unknown. He's shaking his head no. Okay, you don't want to buy them?
Well, I'm just saying those aren't city property.
Pardon?
Those are not city property.
Okay, it means you have to buy them. You have some property here where your station is right now. Why don't you start thinking about buying the property? So that's an unknown. So, to me, you're doing something here that we don't know the answer to yet, and so sometime it's going to come along that, well, we need OE Gray for the fire station, and I don't like that particular approach in trying to make this decision. And the other one was, what do the people think as far as the senior center? My recommendation is to buy the property and have complete control. It is an excellent property. It is well built. You will not find a property built as well as this particular property. And so if you start thinking about going out and building something else, it's going to be expensive, much more than what you're paying here as far as with the armory. So again, I think complete control, and in the future, we'll certainly make excellent use of it as far as parks and recreation. Those are my comments at this point as far as what is known to me.
Okay, Lynn, questions?
The only I've had a couple of questions on my heart for a while, and sitting at the end, I think we all have had the same questions, and so they've already been asked. I did ask Director Lowe for some information so that we can do our due diligence, and the information he did answer. He answered my question. I wanted to know if we put in and purchase this building, how could we get revenues to continue to take care of it, understanding that the building would, even though Ken says it's a really good building, I think I agree with Adam, something's gonna have to happen. We're gonna have to get the full utilization of the building, you're gonna have to put some more money into it. So that was just my concern. If we bought it, I am so against the seniors being in that building on a personal level. It's always about me, but my father is coming here. He's in love with senior homes and senior buildings and activities, and they do so much. They do so much as a group. And the little space that I saw, I just was almost offended that we would even offer that to them. But I think we need to put services and help them have a place that they can call home. And so I wouldn't want that. So I'm kind of torn. I know it would be a fantastic place for rec centers. Our youth need it. We need it as a community. But I don't think we should try to combine them into the seniors into that same spot too. I just don't agree with that one. But I did have my questions answered. So yeah, good.
Pat?
I just have one question and then perhaps a comment. I've spoken with people from the senior center. One comment was made that we're not responsible to provide a commercial grade kitchen for ADRC. Is that true or not?
It goes back and forth. So the conversations we've had with ADRC is they actually prepare the meals now off-site and bring them there. So I'm actually meeting with, I think it's Lori is her name. I'm going to be meeting with her this Friday to kind of talk about what that means. Because one of the conversations we obviously need to have is with the fire station in Oe Gray, we're going to have to figure something out. If potentially there is construction going on there, what does that mean? So the understanding I've heard is they prefer a commercial grade kitchen. That is one of the requirements that typically has been in there. But potentially that could change because they've kind of changed their system a little bit. So.
Yeah, I actually think all the meals that are delivered here at the senior center are made in the at the university. Right, so I know there's repacking that has to go on.
Right.
But there's an actual, okay. I've had several people who have asked to speak. I did tour the
Excuse me,
building.
I'm not
Oh, you
done.
have, okay, go ahead, sorry.
And ultimately, then I've heard from people from the senior center that they were not interested in utilizing the armory. I know the pickleball people have contacted me and said that they want to continue their games through the winter, and I understand that. My belief is that we should look to the future, that we should look at investing this 5 to 10 million in a couple of years in building something along the lines of that which I see in Richland Center, which was a combined facility that was modern heating systems, made for the senior center, made also to be utilized by the community in terms of parks and rec. Just what I've seen,
So are you saying that's this building, or are you saying that's some other building?
I'm gonna say it's another building. I see this building as needing a lot of money, and it's already 80 years old. What are we talking? Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to understand if you wanted to put 5 or 10 million in this building, or if you were talking about a different building. Okay. Okay, and I did go through the building again. I had been through it before. And I agree. It might be a temporary location for the seniors as we work through where, but I think on a long term, it would take a lot of remodeling in a space to adequately serve the seniors. So I really don't see that space exists on a long-term basis. Might be on a short-term basis. I did talk to the two individuals about how they had mitigated lead in other facilities. I believe, Adam, you were there when I had that lengthy conversation with them. And so I will report how they said they had done it in other facilities. And basically, if I recall this right, I wasn't taking notes, but they said they had gone into the room, and in this case, it would be the former range.
Firing range.
And they painted all the walls and the ceiling with epoxy paint. And then the next thing they did was put drywall on all the walls and the ceiling. And the third thing they did then, after that was done, was they epoxy coated the floor. So it was totally epoxy coated. And Todd, I did ask about, because they pointed out where the window was and how it used to vent out and all that, you know. And they do have a, I don't know, a clean bill. They do have a paper from DNR now because they did dig out all the soil around there and remediate that area. And so DNR did come in and give their whatever they call, whatever they.
Final case closure letter.
Oh, is that what it's called?
Final case of closure, yep.
There. Well, they put their stamp of approval on it, whatever that was. So I wasn't as worried about outside, and I would have no idea how much the remediation that they described would cost. But they did explain how they had done it. I thought another interesting thing that we learned was there's 149 armories in Wisconsin.
Yes.
And they are going to sell all but 32 of them. So ours is not the only armory
No.
that's on the block.
Yeah, we're the first one that is kind of setting the precedent for how they handle
Yeah, how they
other
handle it.
sales.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I heard a lot about how today's army is a lot different than it was in the 1940s. I heard a lot of that. Okay, we've had several people who want to speak. Or maybe they don't want to speak. So we'll start out, Isaac, we'll start out with you.
Evening, everybody. Excuse me. So I've talked to a couple of the council members on here and about this, so just kind of did a brief summary here, so.
Isaac lives at
I'm sorry,
1030.
1030 Seymour Street. Sorry about that. So first of all, let's talk the first part about the money. So the city sold this property in 1982 for $50,000. And now the Department of Military wants to sell it back for 135 plus 150 mitigation. I know they gave you a range of 50 to 150, but let's be clear about this. When it comes to government, you're going to spend 150,000 plus dollars on this deal here. I'm going to switch a little bit. Barb, the way they explained to you about the mitigation on how they do it, that's just a cover up. You're not fixing anything. All they're doing is covering up what's already there. And mark my word, in 10, 15 years, there'll be a change of stuff that comes around. They'll come back and say, all right, now you've got to move it. And if you own this building, you're going to pay for it again. So, so the building, when we sold it, was 42 years old, and it's 82 years old now. So we're looking at purchasing something, you know, for $235,000 more than what it was when we sold it for, even though it's 40-some years older. You know, Adam, you gave your numbers on the rough cost of the cost to own it per year, you know, $130,000. The estimated annual maintenance property of $10,000. I think that number is light. So, I mean, just sitting there, size of the building. Eileen, you said, you know, it's a big building. Ken, you said it's structurally sound, which it is. It's a large brick building. The problem with large buildings is they get more expensive to remodel, you know. This building, I've been through it multiple times throughout the years. I've lived in town all my life. I've been down there. It is a great building. You know, it's big. It has everything the guy could want, square footage, large rooms, a basement. But the problem is you're not only looking at the size and the cost of purchasing it, mitigating it, and doing a remodel, you're continuously going to be remodeling an 80-year-old building. And you're going to remodel a building that's 80 years old, and so it's going to cost you more to remodel it than a building that was just 25 or 30 years old. And not only because of the age, but because of the way they built it. They built that thing strong. So it's going to take more money and time to do what you want to do with it. You know, back in December, I sat where Mr. Casper sitting right now, and at that time, you know, we voted down to take the building for approximately $1. So I'm not sure how, when we voted it down for $1, that we're also sitting here now for maybe $135,000 thinking about this. And that doesn't make much sense to me. As well with the, you know, paying $130,000 some dollars more than what we sold it for. As I said, the building's about 82 years old. It would be expensive to maintain, to remodel, to heat, cool. Not including with this building, you know, the city's got some other expenses that we should be looking for and thinking about. You know, we got the fire department coming up here. We got a big grant from the government on there, but again, that's still gonna cost the city millions of dollars to build that building out of our own pocket. You got a street department that needs a new building and has needed a new building for years, a water and sewer department that has needed a new building for years, as well as, just your annual budget that you have right now. I'm pretty sure every department in here is blowing through their fuel budget this year, and is probably gonna blow through it next year. So you're sitting there thinking about what we're already doing, and now you're thinking about adding more cost to it. Let's see. The use of the building, it could be used for multiple things. It could be used for the recreation of the senior center, a community center, but the building wasn't designed for that. I mean, it was designed for one purpose. To change that building for the use of all that is not gonna be a light task. It's not gonna be a quick task either. Not only just money, but you're gonna spend some serious time doing that. The senior center, they've already expressed, they don't want to go there. And that building is not set up for them. And no matter how you remodel that building, it's not set up for them. The parking lot is uphill. The one ramp that goes in the building that I remember is on the southwest side of the property, which is on the complete opposite side of the building. The offices are small. Again, it's just not set up for them. And they deserve a building or a site that is suited their needs and their wants. The seniors do a lot of good stuff for the city of Platteville. They pay their taxes over the years, so they deserve something that, is for what they need and to match their accessibility and use. As for keeping the property or putting on, possibly owning it, selling it with the new owner giving us the right to use it, sell the property, sell it right out, put the money back on the tax rolls. You put a tax bill on there, $250,000, I think, Jason, you asked the question, $250,000 assessment, you're looking at approximately $250 a year. I mean, the city doesn't get all that. You got the School of Southwest Tech and stuff, but you're looking at over $3,000 a year for that. You take the two lots that are next to it, you offer that to whoever buys the building. Again, you add more money to the tax roll. The city has to start looking at putting money back into the tax roll instead of just keep taking it out, and this is a prime example of taking it out. I know, Adam, you've stated that you've had some interest from some people that are interested if the city were to sell it to them to allow the city to lease it and use it. Having people being interested in it and actually having it happen for a certain price is two different things. You're really going to limit the use or the potential buyers if you start putting that requirement on there. They might have a little bit of space, but more than likely you're going to get somebody that's going to borrow money on this, and their bank's going to want fair market rent. You've already went through this with the library. You're promised $1, and you're paying how much a month for rent up there, and that's probably going to happen in this case here again. So finally, would the building be a perfect spot for park and recreation? Yes, no. Would it be nice to have it? Yes. Nice for community center? Yes. But does it make financial sense at this time to do this when there's other needs that the city is already in need of? So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isaac. Mary Larson, you wanted to speak. Okay, you don't want to speak. Okay. Marvin Packer, you just wanted to register. And it didn't say you're registering in favor or against, you're just registering. Okay, he's registering. Okay, I have Ray Banfi who wanted to register against using the Armory as part of the senior center middle floor. I have Ann Schwingle, who wanted to register against. And I have Josephine Kisher, who wants to register against. So that is the extent of the people. So now the question is before the council. My understanding, to repeat the options. One option is that the city simply passes. If the city simply passes at this time, it's my understanding that the Department of Military Affairs will list it on the Wisconsin surplus auction site, and it will be available to whoever.
Yep.
Joe, could you tell us what the zoning would be on the property?
The property right now is zoned institutional, so it's fairly limited, but somebody could request a rezone if there was a particular need that they're.
So if somebody were to purchase it, and my understanding is a couple of things. First of all, have we completed a transaction with the Department of Military Affairs that transfers the lift station to us?
So that is part of the process, correct?
That's part of this 135?
No, that will be done regardless if we accept it or not.
Not gonna,
That quitclaim deed has been issued, Barb.
pardon?
That quitclaim deed has been issued.
The quitclaim deed has been issued, so, okay. For those who don't know, there's property on the south side that there is a lift station in, and that property is being transferred to the city. So the property we're talking about then that is owned by the Department of Military Affairs has the armory itself on it, correct? And goes all the way back to Lutheran Street in a very narrow width because there was a street discontinuance at one point in time. The city owns basically two lots, one big one and one small one, that the parking lot sits on. But the majority of the parking lot is really city-owned. Is that correct?
3, Barb, sorry.
Pardon?
We own 3 lots.
3 lots.
Two fuller ones. I can show you the map if you would like.
Oh, well, I was just looking at the Grant County map, so it must not be quite right. That's fine, but there are lots there.
Yes.
That used to face on a street,
Correct.
but the street was discontinued. So Joe, it's zoned institutional. What is the rest of the property in that area zoned?
I believe all the rest of the surrounding properties are probably R2, 1 to 2 family residential.
Okay. All right, so one option is that it goes on the surplus auction side. It goes on with its current zoning of institutional, which is limiting in terms of what it could be. Can it be a storage unit? Can it be, what are the uses in institutional?
I'd have to look at all the one, but obviously it's all the schools, city buildings.
Or institutional?
Or institutional, hospital, some nursing homes, that type of use.
Okay. So mostly publicly,
Right.
Mostly
We
public.
have some daycares that are institutional, churches.
okay. All right, so that would be one option, that we decline it entirely. A second option is that we buy it outright.
Yep.
And that's $135,000,
Correct.
and we take it as is.
Yep.
So that's the second option. The third option is that we tell the Department of Military Affairs that we're going to,
Yeah, I think it's two-pronged. You'd be asking the Department of Military Affairs if you could do a request for proposals and essentially have part of that be part of the purchase price. So essentially, you're accepting the 135, have it go out for request for proposals, and that individual then purchases it for that amount and pays the DMA. And you try to do that before January, essentially 2023. The other option then is we're doing some type of short-term financing to cover that gap. And going out for a request for
I
proposal.
guess we'll not
Right.
talk about the financing
Right.
yet. We'll just talk about what the three
Yeah,
options.
I mean, essentially, you're doing an RFP.
All right.
and whether
One
that's a
is
request.
buy it outright and it's just ours
Yep.
and we remodel it. One is decline it entirely, and the other is this kind of hybrid situation where we tell the DMA that we want to do an RFP, and we kind of accept the 135. And what if we do an RFP and somebody comes back with 50,000 instead of 135? Then are we on the hook for the other 85?
That'd be the question you have to ask the DMA if they'll accept that or not.
If they would accept
The answer
50?
would be yes. So, I mean,
The
essentially.
answer is that we would be on the hook
We'd
for
be
85.
on the hook. Right.
I realize we're talking about sort of a fast train here. Would we have time to, I see this is on for action, but
You can move to table.
before I feel like I could make an adequate decision, I would like to see, number one, it's a beautiful building. And if we have use for it, what I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around is if we would buy it outright or if we would go the RFP route, what would our revenues look like versus our expenses? Is this something that we could even begin to think that we could tolerate? Before we would talk about major renovations. I'm
So-
talking about in
So
the
is-
next 1 to 2 years.
So is there a way to do a pro forma on it, is really what you're saying?
Yeah.
Is there a way to show a revenue and expenditure plan? I mean, I
There-
think
I
that
mean, but-
since,
Yeah.
I think that since the DMV, DMA, whatever they are, have said that we could go till January, whatever, I think, Kathy, you can move to table with the express request that you get a better financial picture.
That's really where I'm at. Just a little more realistic. So it's sort of like doing more of that due diligence before we would say, well, we just can't afford it. What is it that we can't afford? What do those numbers really look like? So
So are you
I w-
moving
I
to
would
table?
make a motion that we table it in,
All right.
I'll second that.
So a motion to table is not debatable. We have a motion to table, and so Candace, we will, table till the next meeting, Kathy?
yes.
Okay, Jason?
Yes.
Okay. Candace? It's non-debatable. You can't,
Okay, sorry.
I believe we still need to vote on that.
right, I was gonna say, Candace will vote.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, I thought you were looking for more
No.
input from the council.
No, I'm looking to you, Candace,
Got it.
so we can vote.
Is that
Killing.
enough time for to get the information?
Yeah,
We'll do our
Yeah,
best.
it depends on, there you go.
Yep.
Depends on how exact detailed you're hoping to be. But
Will
can
we know
do-
anything about the
We can
fires?
do market on the, net. We can do all of that and give you market numbers. And then the reality, the question unknown and which you're all dealing with is what are the expenses? And I have contacted mitigating companies, 2 or 3 of them, and I can't get a response. Simply because the inside is regulated by OSHA, it is not regulated by the DNR. So OSHA is different. So there's, the unknown is, okay, what's mitigating, what's remediating, what's acceptable, what's not. I mean, but we could give you all the epoxy numbers if in that number you want, okay, I want this area epoxied, I want this, what they recommended was just what you heard, which was epoxy and, in fact, drywall, which is gonna be minimal at best, $30,000 maybe. But
all right, so, we're not gonna debate these through right now.
question for you.
We have a
Okay.
tabling, just a minute. We have a motion to table. I would suggest that if you have specific items that you want to see in the expense and/or the income projections, that you individually contact Bob and say, I want to know about mitigation. How big is this room? How much mitigation? If it's whatever. I mean, we can't talk about all those tonight.
Right, prior to her saying something, I asked you if you were looking for a motion. So I already was bringing up a motion prior to,
I understand.
okay, so. I guess my ultimate opinion is these people have already thought about the costs most likely associated with this issue. And I think off the cuff right now, they could probably answer with some accuracy as to whether this is doable or not. And why waste their time in coming out with more numbers if they already have a general opinion based off of their professional.
Well, I guess
Work.
I guess there are people here who would like to see those in writing. And so I think that's what Kathy has asked, and we do have this motion. Ken, what's your question?
My question is, when is the fire station gonna come out with information as far as what your design is gonna be? How soon?
So as of right now, that's slated for November 8th.
November 8th.
Yep.
So
Yep.
can we keep our table date after November 8th so we know that answer?
So I would argue you're looking at two separate issues, because as
I
far
know,
as
But the issue is here, the senior center in OE Gray.
right, but I would say as far as I've been directed so far by the council is that's where the fire station is going.
I know the fire station's going, but the
Yep.
question is how much they're taking for space. And
Based on
that's what we don't
Right.
know. We don't know that. We're shooting in the dark.
I would say based on the feedback as we've been moving forward, the 3 acres is going to be used. So I
Are
would say
they taking OE Gray?
yes.
Yes.
Are they taking OE Gray?
Yes.
And why do they have to take OE Gray?
Because in talking with our building specialists right now, the cost of maintaining that building is not looking at the architects, they have already said, in order to do the upgrades, it's not keepable.
And the architects are this group that we've hired so far.
Yep. Yeah, they showed that, I would say in the original plan that was done in the concept study, they showed that pretty much to put what would be about a 32,000 square foot facility, which again is plus or minus what we're looking at. It's going to take up the entire spot.
So they're gonna tear down the whole OE Gray.
That's the current recommendation.
Okay, folks, we have a motion to table. Candace will vote.
Killian,
What is the table date to?
Yeah, to the next meeting.
2 weeks?
Yes.
I would vote yes to table.
Nichols,
Yes.
Cop,
Yes.
Arts,
Yes.
Parrot, Casper,
No.
Doss,
Yes.
motion carries.
Okay. So, the sooner we can see those financials, the better. Okay. The next item for action on our agenda is to set the public hearing on November 22nd for the street discontinuance, Amar Drive and part of Calhoun Drive. Joe?
Right, so there's some folks that are looking at doing the development of part of that Golden Heights Estate subdivision that it's been platted but not improved, so their proposed layout would not require the streets as they're currently platted, so they want to discontinue all of Amar Drive, part of Calhoun Drive. So it's a lengthy statutorily required process, so kind of the first step is to set a public hearing in advance for that. So that is all we're asking for this evening, is to set the date for public hearing on November 22nd. Then it would go to the Plan Commission for their review and then come back to the council for action on that date.
Okay, any questions on this? Do I hear a motion?
I'll move to approve setting a public hearing for November 22nd, 2022 to consider the discontinuance of Amar Drive and part of Calhoun Drive.
Second. Candace?
I didn't hear the second, I'm sorry.
Oh, Eileen?
Okay, thank you. Killian,
Yes.
Nichols,
Yes.
Cop,
Yes.
Arts,
Yes.
Parrot,
Yes.
Casper,
Yes.
Doss,
Yes.
motion carries.
Okay, the next action item is the adoption of the staffing plan.
Yeah, so within the 2022 city goals is the action step to work on the creation of a long-term City of Platteville staffing analysis and to propose implementation within the 2023 City of Platteville operating budget. So in working with department directors and with the assistance of city manager intern Carol Swain, in order to complete the staffing analysis, a 4-phased approach was developed and executed, which I'm just going to quickly go. So there was phase 1, which was conducted in March and April of 2022. This was internal analysis and looking at municipal peer comparisons of job descriptions and also organizational charts. Phase 2 was conducted in April through August of 2022 and involved individual department meetings and then also determining needs versus wants. Phase 3 was conducted in August and September of 2022 and really was the mapping out of our long-term plan. And then phase 4 was essentially the presentation of findings to the council, which occurred in September and then also during this meeting as well. So I want to acknowledge the work done by city staff in finalizing this plan. The staff truly created a plan which understands the budgetary complexities and climate we are currently facing. City manager intern Carol Swain did an amazing job incorporating all of the department's ideas and thoughts into a cohesive document. I want to stress again, this is a plan and provides a framework to strive towards accomplishing over the next 10 years. Adopting this plan is not guaranteeing everything within the plan will be able to be achieved or funded. This plan provides a unified effort between the council and city staff to continue to maintain and improve the operations of the city of Platteville. So as far as the budget and fiscal impact, so moving forward each year, the recommendations of the staffing plan will be added for consideration within the proposed city of Platteville operating budget. If financial flexibility exists and the consensus is achieved by the common council members, that particular year's recommendations will be adopted. If unfortunately, due to budgetary limitations, the proposed staffing changes cannot be achieved, the recommendations will be considered in future budgets. So during the presentation of the 2023 City of Platteville operating budget, I'll go into more detail about how the City of Platteville will be able to achieve the staffing proposals indicated in year one of the staffing plan. The main recommendations will be a reclassification of the full-time GIS specialist position, which is currently vacant, to be contracted out. The budgetary savings of roughly $65,000 is proposed to be utilized to offset the changes in the staffing plan, along with increased revenue expectations for the museum. So the city staff is recommending the Common Council officially adopt the 2022 City of Platteville Long-Range Staffing Plan. So what we have here, obviously in your packets, is the official staffing plan that we're looking to adopt to tonight. It's also on the screen here. For the interest of time, I'm obviously not going to divulge too much into it. But what you can see here is we did a kind of a SWOT analysis showing the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that the city of Platteville is facing. Obviously then looked at our organizational chart. And then what the plan goes into is specifically each individual department and shows you a short and mid and long range proposal. Short term is things that we are going to be proposing to the council within the next 1 to 3 years. Medium term then is about 3 to 7 years. And long term then is 8+. And some of the items, obviously, that we have talked about where you'll see highlighted throughout this plan are only if either there is budgetary flexibility, we have the financial ability to do it, or potentially we see an increase in population that would require that. So primarily each individual department talks about kind of the reasons why we are looking to do this. A lot of the changes you are seeing within the 1-year proposal are really are due to what we are seeing in the market in regards to positions. So it is trying to make sure that we are staying competitive and being able to continue to retain our employees, but then also make sure that we are retracting and being obviously compensation wise and also within the realm of trying to recruit. So a lot of these changes that you're seeing long-term are things that are going to continually be discussed as we look at future budgets. So those will be proposals that you'll see as we talk about in the budgetary process, and obviously we'll have discussions about that. What you're noticing in regards to when we get to kind of the overall plan here and showing departments is when we're talking about 1 to 3, the first 1 year, the only additional employee we are looking to add is essentially a part-time custodial position. That would be looking to address some of the concerns that we have found within our park and rec, our museum, and also the Broski Center. The rest of these potential financial changes are really, again, they are market changes to try to be more in line with where we are seeing positions in regards to recruiting and also retention. So a lot of that is being achieved. Again, how we're achieving this budgetarily is going to be by essentially taking our GIS position, which is a full-time position, and now contracting that out and using those budgetary savings to potentially apply to this to try to keep it as budget neutral as possible. Then again, as it kind of finalizes here in the plan, it shows you throughout all of our departments over the next kind of 3 to 7 years, and then talks about 8 to 10. Then we kind of go through the financial options here that show you the impact to the tax rate. What we tried to do in all of our proposals with this was to try to keep the tax impact obviously below 1.5%. So as we talked about, with every about $47,000 to $49,000 of tax base that comes in, that increases the tax rate by 1%. So our goal was to try to always keep that as flat as we could with about a 1.5% increase. And then as we go into future years, we can kind of have those future conversations and talk about long-term planning in regards to, if the population increases, that is potentially additional DPW staff that we need park and rec staff that we need, water and sewer. If we don't see that, then potentially we won't need those changes. That's kind of the quick version for you.
Okay, questions, discussion on the adoption of the staffing plan. And as Adam has indicated, this is a plan dependent on whether or not there are adequate revenues.
Right.
Kathy?
This is a very complicated process. And I know that it is one of the things that we talked about months ago, needing to see, so that we're not
Yep.
sort of like all of a sudden saying we need this position or that position. My overall question when I was going through this is, and I'm not sure if it's the correct phrase.
Sure.
Does the city have a tipping point? Are we, with our population, with our mill rate, where are we in relationship with other communities as far as staffing and benefits? Are we really low? I mean, I think we all agree we're trying to take care of our staff, and then when I was looking at the bills that were in the packet, it's sort of like, well, I think we are, because payroll for this time was 182,000. State retirement was 48,000. Multiple courts insurance was 110,000.
Right.
So it's telling me that we're in there, but are we in the middle? Or that's why I'm saying, what is our tipping point? Are we safe to say that as the population grows, we will need this? Or are we to the point where, if we really need to be doing the right thing, is that an adequate timeline? I'm not questioning the process that you did.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to absorb where are we compared to everybody else?
Yeah, so I would say, to answer your question, Kathy, and great questions, by the way, because that's exactly what went into kind of this plan. Is the reason why we looked at 10 years was, do I think that every single department had, and I would tell you, I think if I would ask any one of my directors, would they tell you they need more employees? Absolutely. I don't think there's any question that the amount of work that they are doing is definitely overwhelming, but I give all of our staff kudos because they continue to come in day out and do the best they can. The struggle that we obviously see, and I think it's going to come up when we get into the actual budgetary conversations, to answer your question, where are we at as far as being competitive? We're low. And I think that's reality. And not only are we low from a municipality standpoint, we're low just from a competitive standpoint outside of the board. Now, there are plenty of municipalities that are not alone in that scenario. So I think that's also why one of the things we've talked about next year is needing to do another comprehensive staffing compensation plan analysis. And using some of our ARPA funds, you're going to see that in the budget, that we're going to be proposing that to really try to gauge that question. Are there some of our positions, we have noticed, we're definitely either in line or we're close. But are we lower than some? Absolutely. And a lot of that plays into, there's some variables there. Some of it is when you're talking about, specifically with police, are we lower? Yes, we are. But we also have more police officers. So that's some of the struggle that we're dealing with, is when you're talking with other municipalities, they only have 3 police officers. We have 20. So they may be able to have a higher rate than us. But we also need to be cognizant of that because, do we have a great police force? Absolutely. But is that a struggle then to keep our officers, no fault to their own, when they can go and make X amount of dollars elsewhere? And that's the same thing across the board. So really with this plan, what we tried to do was look at, okay, are we meeting, in order to keep the current status quo of what we're doing, not necessarily, try to improve systematically, but also look at, how do we impact the tax rate? Yes, there are plenty of positions that we could have put into this plan, but I can tell you, and that, what is that going to do to the tax rate? Boom. It's going to do this, because it is. There's a lot of cost to that. So we looked at trying to really measure in the next, 3 to 5 years, what are those positions that we absolutely want to make sure we're staying competitive. That's why you're seeing in the budget proposal, we're talking about making changes to HR, looking at that, because again, we want to make sure that the person we brought in is competitive there. Looking at our 2 director positions and all of our director positions, considering in the future, as we talked about in year 2, we have a assistant director of public works position we're going to be talking about. That is, again, no discredit to this man here, but I also know that eventually this guy might want to retire. So we have to start, I'm not going to let him, but we need to start thinking about that. That's kind of the long-term planning. So looking at all of those things. So this plan is something that will adjust, I think, to kind of your questions, Kathy, is as we start to see the need, whether that's more in the library, more in, some of those amenities, more in public works staff, or again, in some of our other community development, we're going to be adding to this plan and looking at that. So that's something where this was kind of the starting point, and our plan is every year is to kind of look at this and modify and make sure that we're still being competitive and realistic. Because even if that does tip the needle on the tax rate, if that's truly what this municipality needs in order to get the job done, we're going to have a conversation about that.
So is that the tipping point you were talking about, or were you talking about a monetary tipping point?
No,
Okay,
that's exactly what I was looking for.
okay,
Yeah.
good. Any other questions, suggestions, ideas, comments?
I do have one other thing relating to the fire department, and I would like to tag on what you said about the police. I sit on that commission, and that's a place that we really do need to make sure is a priority, that the wages and benefits are adequate to recruit. But I'm curious, in this staffing plan, and I realize it's the medium term, but
Yep.
under the fire department, allocating paid per call firefighters, allow them $10 per call. What is that? I mean, going to compensate a volunteer $10 to go out on a call? That's it? I mean, are there requirements that because we have a volunteer department you can't do more than that, or is that a sort of because I think that is, if that can be increased, that needs to be increased. $10 a call is 2 gallons of gas, and maybe that would get them here to there, but that's the only issue
Right.
that I really have with that. It's like $10 for a call. Okay. Just raising the awareness.
Other questions? Kathy, I agree. This is something we've needed because every once in a while people will propose somebody be added, and then it's like, well, how does that work? And if, so kudos to the staff for working through this. And yes, it's a plan, and we can be hopeful.
That's right.
And we can plan. Now we just have to have the revenue to implement the plan. So we're looking for a motion to adopt the plan.
I move to officially adopt the 2022 City of Platteville Long Range Staffing Plan.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Eileen and a second by Kathy to officially adopt the staffing plan as presented. We'll vote.
Killian,
Yes,
Nichols,
Yes.
Cop,
Yes.
Arts,
Yes.
Parrot,
Yes.
Casper,
Yes.
Doss.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, those are the action items for the night. We will go on to information and discussion. The planned unit development at 305, I think it's 305 East Side Road. Joe?
Yes, so the general development plan for this project was already approved, so this is the specific implementation plan, which provides some additional guidelines, but just to recap, this is for the Family Advocates proposed building would be half office building for the staff and then a half domestic shelter, 13,240 square feet. The GDP was approved with the condition that a development agreement be executed, and you did see a preliminary draft of that document. So staff would recommend approval of the second part of the PUD with that same condition that it would be subject to the development agreement. And there's some additional building details in their packet.
Okay, questions on the specific implementation plan here for the development at 305 East Side Road?
I have a question.
Okay,
As far as looking at the design information, very difficult to read. Is this going to be enlarged next time? So how can we read this? This is impossible to read.
Yeah, we can provide some 11 by 17 printouts for the.
I mean, I have a few questions, but you can't even, you look at this and difficult.
Ken, would you be willing to go in and see Joe? I mean, he may
No,
have a big,
It's the engineer.
or whoever has these plans. Dan?
Well, my question is, did the plan commission have to look at this same size information?
Yes.
Make a decision?
Yep.
On the basis of this, what you saw here?
Well, when you put it on your computer screen, you can enlarge it,
Yeah.
which is what many of us did.
I am. Could I look at this and determine anything? No, I'm going to have some faith that the people who want this building built it the way they wanted it, and that's their problem. So if the plan was to whether we should have it out in our industrial park, and as to whether they're going to pay something in lieu of taxes, I'm good with that. If they want to put a bathroom in the northeast corner and make it 5 stalls, I could care less. So that's the way I looked at it. I have no business with what they want in regards to their building. But where it's at, that's our business, and whether they're paying taxes, that's our business. So that's why, no, with my reading glasses, I can't read this either.
So I would say also that there was a picture of what the outside would look like, because I believe that that's pertinent to council discussion too. We've talked often about how exteriors look and then how they exit and enter to the road. I tend to agree. The inside of the building, Todd, is, you know, whether they have a big room and 3 little rooms or 4 big rooms, or, yeah.
I will ask my questions next time.
Okay. All right, we will then move on in our agenda to the next information item, which is the certified survey map for Southwest Health. And that would be Joe also.
Yes, so you may have noticed Southwest Health has started the infrastructure work on their project. It's a mixed-use development next to their hospital property. You had previously approved a preliminary plat for that project, which did the general layout. So right now they just submitted a certified survey map, which will formally dedicate part of that street as a public street. It's identified as Performance Drive. And then at this point, they're just creating 2 lots. They're 5.5 and 4.5 acres approximately, with the idea that those would be further subdivided as an actual project comes in, so they can size the lot to fit the need of that particular development. So this is, it's still very preliminary, I guess, as far as the overall layout, but this at least gets to the point where they have a platted street and can further divide the lots as needed. Any
Questions on? Questions, then we'll move that to action for the next time too. And now we're on to our financial management plan. And I see that David is here, and Nicola, do you have something that you'd like to say.
Just thank you, Dave, for being here, and for the work that you've done in preparing our financial management plan. And I will hand it over to Dave, who's handing out some copies of the plan so that you have a hard copy version. The plan includes both for the TID districts as well as for the rest of the city. It's a 5-year plan, and it attempts to incorporate, and I'm trying to fill some time here, but it it attempts to incorporate, what's going on in our economy with inflation, which is difficult. But yeah, with that said, I thought I was handing over to Dave. There we go. Thank you.
So I'm going to try to condense my words because, as some of you know, when we sat like across the street at the police building, this can go on for 45 minutes, and I kind of feel like after you've been through an hour and 45 minutes, maybe you want me to speak less. So there's a lot of slides in here that are probably informational things that basically back up some of the things that the plan is about, and I'm going to breeze by those. If you find that there's something in there that I'm breezing by that is important to you, stop me. I'll answer a question on it, but I'm going to try to get to the meat and potatoes a little bit faster so that we can get to that and give you a chance to ask questions without taking up a huge amount of time, because I know Adam's going to bore you with a bunch of financial information like I am right now too. So
Keep going, Dave, because
yeah.
then they'll fall asleep.
Well, I think that one time we were at the police building that Ken actually had a hard stop, so I was wondering if maybe that was coming up here soon. You have a hard stop tonight? As far as what time we can stop talking?
Buy it.
Excellent. So this is just some of the objectives. I don't really need to read through them, but they're the things that we typically go through when we come here for the plan. So those are the things we're going to go through as far as the background, some highlights, observations. We'll capital and debt plan, the general fund projections. We'll look at levy limits. Kind of the overall thing. But we also have two variations of the plan. One where we have the administrator's all-in capital plan, although I've heard that's changed. We also had something that changed with what I had already. So there's probably 3 different versions of the all-in plan right now. And so I'll touch on what the version I have is, and then we'll show you what the alternative one, which is the one that basically follows how you've been issuing debt in the past, where you're only borrowing the next year what you paid off in principal. So that we'll kind of jump to that at that point. So this is just basically the structure of the plan. The CIP you work on quite a bit. You've got the operating accounts that kind of lead into this as well. The debt service that goes into the capital plan, and then we use equalized value to kind of have comparability throughout the plan from year to year. If we were use assessed value, usually doesn't change unless you reassess, and you'd have to reassess every year. And so that tax rate, that we're showing, basically the 2023 number for assessed value is about $8.27 per thousand of assessed value, and the equalized rate is $7.32. But next year, if the equalized value goes up a lot, that's going to change a lot. So what we want to do is just keep comparability with equalized, which is basically all municipalities can be compared when you have equalized as that comparison. As far as the long-range goals, I can't keep turning or else I don't actually hit the microphone here. We want this to be something that you use as your guide as far as what you're going to do, how the tax levy is affected by, whether it's your operations or your capital. It helps to make your decision-making process, because you'll kind of have an idea of what it does as far as the plan that you have. And it'll help you identify pressure points. And I think the big pressure point that you're going to see through this plan, and probably what the staff has already talked about with the staffing plan and what Adam will talk about next, is inflation is not a friend. So the bond rating, as you know, this year we went through another borrowing, and we talked to S&P about your rating. And these are just the statistics of what they go through as far as determining your rating. Institutional framework is really something that is something that's general to all the municipalities in the state, and usually that's a average rating of an A. They look at your economy. That obviously is something you can't do anything about. They look at your management. What kind of policies do you have in place that directs the city? I think you've got a pretty good set of policies here, so they look at that favorably. Financial measures, liquidity is a big thing. That budget flexibility that Adam talked about earlier is a big thing. And then, how much debt you have and how much that's holding you back. I'm not going to go through the rating stuff right now because we actually had that within the document that we gave you on sale day. But this year you were affirmed as a AA minus stable, which is where you've been for a while. Basically, you have a lot of things that are very strong on their strengths, and adequate, like I said, is what everybody in the state is as far as institutional framework. Economy, you're weak, and they point out the per capita stuff, and debt. You just have, you've been coming down as far as your debt burden, but it's still something that's out there, and it's actually not uncommon to Wisconsin as well. And as far as the metrics of what the S&P showed you, you actually didn't change as far as any of your categories last year. So you stayed strong, you're keeping to your policies, and it's keeping your rating at a AA minus. As far as changing your rating, obviously there's some things that you have to be comparable with higher rated peers to be into a rating that's a little higher. So there's economic indicators that kind of hold you back there. And what would take you down is if you started to use your fund balance and basically lose some of your liquidity, and that would be obviously something that'd be bad for the city as far as losing that flexibility that you've had in the budget. This is just a little table that shows if with your rating, I actually had, because we used to have a service that gave us what the ratings were basically on AA, whatever. And so what I ended up doing is taking your sale this year and then finding another sale that was a similar time with a lower rating, which was actually non-rated. And really, the size of the issue has a lot to do with what you save. But you can tell, if you weren't rated, you would have paid an extra $30,000. So that's kind of the reason why you get rated. The bigger the issue, the bigger the savings. So. As far as the items that are affecting this plan, inflation is obviously a big deal. The expenditure restraint program percentage is 7.7%. Obviously, we know that there's other types of commodities that are a lot more than 7.7%. In fact, I think if I was reading some of the note in here we go. No, it doesn't say it. There are other supply items that have gone up about 30 to 50%, and I've sat through enough council meetings and board meetings to hear some vendors when they're talking about the prices of even fire trucks that it's just ridiculous how much some of those costs have gone up. Interest rates, from the beginning of the year, we had like the 1 year maturity was at like 0.19%. We're now more like at 2.8% or 2.95% as far as that 1 year maturity. So interest rates have gone crazy. So that's affected even how we're forecasting your interest rates in this plan. Levy limits are more difficult due to low net new construction, and of course, as I said before, levy limits don't give you anything for inflation. Expenditure restraint, they say you can have 7.7% increase in your expenditure restraint based on inflation, but you get rewarded for staying within that policy, but you don't actually have the ability to tax to get that, to be responsible. So you're basically being penalized for being responsible, but you're getting money back from the state for being responsible, but you can't tax to get up to it. So it's kind of a ridiculous program, and really it's something that the state really needs to fix, because how do you do your staffing plan without being able to raise your revenue? I mean, it's a big deal, right? The reassessment stuff makes comparability reporting years more difficult. I know Nicola and I kind of talked about how to present things, and really when you're talking about assessed value, if your assessed value stays the same every year, and the market value keeps going up, there's a pretty big change. And so, it's hard to really do a bunch of comparability. So that was something that affected this plan. These are just some observations about last year's to this year's, what the plan said last year as far as what actually happened. So that's just a little bit of information for you. And then, we've talked about this in the past. It probably can drop off, but your TIF 6 has had some improvement, so we're not anticipating any levy support in the future. Just changes in what happened as far as your levy compared to the plan, the actual levy compared to the plan, so you can see where the funds changed as far as what the plan said last year. Then there's some items that basically show how staff kind of pulled together wage increases or fringe increases in some of the forecasting that we have in the plan. As far as actions, and obviously 2017 was a big year as far as making changes, but that restructuring of the debt to flatten out the impact on the budget, limited new debt to the levy supported. That's really just a practice as opposed to a policy. And then you delayed the implementation of the compensation plan until 2022, which is obviously what you talked about tonight, which actually might be delayed to 2023, right? So, as far as growth goes, you had some pretty good growth. The thing that's kind of crazy about this year's growth is that a big chunk of it was economic. So really, you want that growth rate to be new construction because that spreads the taxes out across people that weren't paying before. Fortunately, when your value goes up by economic, you really are, if you raise your taxes to take advantage of that raise in the percentage of the equalized, you're really hitting your existing people instead of those people that are new to town. So that's kind of something that we had this big pop. You can see that fifth green bar. Yeah, we had that big pop, but really that's economic, and if the housing market goes down, you might see that go down. So the other thing that's important on this item is that in the TIF districts, TIF 5 is potentially has a closure in 2025, so there's a little bit of a bump up in here. Otherwise, we're only using about 0.25% as a growth rate, and we did that based on some historical information that we were looking at. The next item is just your base case. What this is this is where you were as of 12/31/21. Actually, I think even the 22 issue is in here as well, but this is where you were as far as what you had for outstanding obligations, which is mostly general obligation. Then you have some sources that pay for this debt, which is the TIF districts. I don't think the utilities have a part of it. This is mostly TIF that has the amounts that they pay for, and then you have the amount that the levy pays for, which is in 2022 was $1,599,000 and projected to be about $1,650,000 next year. So the one thing to look at on this schedule is that the far right column has a decreasing tax rate, and really that's important for flexibility into building new projects into and being able to pay for those. As far as the CIP funding, really, as far as how we have it set up in the plan, taking the administrator CIP budget, we have tax levy, we bring in some unspent funds from the prior year that we had available, and then we have something where because of our budget flexibility, we actually transfer money from the general fund over the capital to help fund things. There are other things like wheel taxes and things like that that are in here as well, and that all goes in to try to help fund your capital plan. As far as the next schedule, it's kind of tiny, but really the most important thing on this is really this is the all-in schedule. I think the local property tax was reduced from some of the work that Nicola and I did together. We actually popped that into the bond proceeds instead, just to make sure that we had a funded CIP. So this plan is everything that is in your list and has a funding source identified for it. And then, basically you're funding exactly what you're paying for. So that's just a schedule showing, what all the revenue sources are and then what all the costs are. I didn't go to that. So this is just a graphical version of that. Kind of shows that we don't have enough revenues outside of the tax levy to be able to pay for all this or borrowing. So the non-borrowing, non-tax levy revenues are the green. The purple is the projects that are in the CIP. And then you can see those lines kind of show what the borrowing is doing versus the property tax as far as funding it up to its full amount. Policies you have in place is long-term borrowing will be confined to projects and equipment that cannot be financed from current revenues. You try to borrow, or you try to not borrow for things that have a useful life less than 5 years. The term of the obligation should not exceed the economic life of the improvement. That's, you want to match your repayments of debt to how long that asset's going to be around. You try not to have more than 75% of your annual capital improvements, no more than 75% of the annual capital improvements will be financed with long-term debt. And then you have your debt capacity policy, which is something we have a picture of later on that you adhere to as well. The other thing that I think that staff wanted to make sure that we said is that procedure that we do where we only borrow the next year the same amount that we paid off is just that. It's just a practice that you've done. It actually isn't in your policy. So, I think, like I talked about when we were here just talking about our services, I do have something along that kind of talks about what we could do with debt capacity. Obviously, the more we use of the debt capacity, the more we borrow, we're going to increase the tax rate. So that's the part that I don't have put together. But I think you do have flexibility to actually increase your project costs if you decided to do so. And actually, the all-in CIP plan isn't too far off from being at that level. It's a little bit less than the schedule that I put together. So this is basically the way that we size up how big the borrowing is going to be. So the all-in policy said this is the amount we're going to do in borrowing. We brought that in. We put some issuance expenses on there as estimates, and then there's a little bit of interest income, and we round to the $5,000 amount. So that's why everything's in $5,000 increments down at the sizing part. You can tell that we also had a year where there was not enough money, so it might be something that you would not go to the market for. You might go to the bank. So I don't have any issuance costs on those because you can get a loan from a bank potentially for that kind of a dollar amount. So we didn't want to put too much on there. And then the next thing is really the tax impact. And this would take, basically that pink column well, let me start. The stuff on the left is what I showed you earlier, which was the base case. So that is basically, you saw that on an earlier slide. The pink part is the 5 years of projects that we have basically structured out so that we have a tax levy one that can pay for your projects and remains stable. I tried to bring that down some. There's a couple years in there where I was trying to at least have $100,000 maturity because that's a saleable maturity in the market. And so to try to get a certain amount paid for over the 5 years, that $2.40 was really the lowest amount that I could use and be able to basically pay for your plan. So the one thing I also demonstrate on this schedule is that, instead of the 0.25% growth, which isn't very much and doesn't really bring your tax rate down, you'll see that if we add 3% growth, that your tax rate really flows down nicely, and you have plenty of flexibility at that point. So, that's kind of a wild card, but that's something you'd hope that would come in and help your plan. The one big blip that I do have in the overall plan is that I did have to go up to $2.47 on the equalized mill rate for 2028, and that's the year I think that the fire station project is in, and that's a little bigger borrowing, so it hits you a little bit, and I couldn't get that structured under the 240. So just some graphical schedules. This is basically the debt service property tax and tax rate schedule. So it's kind of what I showed you on the last page, but you can see it graphically. We're trying to flatten out that schedule so that your tax rate is smooth. We're hoping for a little bit of growth so that you can actually have a little bit more dollar wise, but we're trying to hold the tax rate and with the intent that growth is new and we can spread it out so that everybody's taxes stay the same. You can see there's a little bit of bump up in the tax levy dollars, and that's those TIF districts closing, and that helped us bump it up in that 25 year. Next graph is really the debt capacity with the all-in, and as you can tell that we are relatively high at the end of 21, but we're actually paying things off, and even with a fairly aggressive couple project years in here, you're actually paying down your debt capacity. And this percentage that's on here is actually a percentage of your self-imposed. So it's a certain percentage of that 70%. And so that's not the percentage of the blue line, it's the percentage of the red line on this graph. So we wanted to show you how much of your self-imposed you're using. That's just a lot of numbers that say the same thing as the graph, so I'm not going to talk about that. If you want to look at that, that kind of backs up what the last schedule was. So as far as the operating projection, basically, I think probably if you've been around the city long enough, you know that there isn't really a way to increase your non-tax revenues very easily. There isn't things that make you be able to add a whole bunch of revenues to your repertoire here. So you're kind of stuck with a flat revenue outside of the property tax, and then levy limits kind of stifle that as well. So, as far as like having revenues that cover your budget, I think the way that, I'm trying to think of how we scheduled it here, I think. So we use the levy limit as the sheet to show the pressure. So when we did the general fund, we actually balanced the general fund in the projection, but that's not realistic. I mean, you're not able to increase your taxes to actually do that, and that's with levy limits and the inability to cover your inflationary amounts, whether it's personnel or commodities, really that tax levy projection is not a realistic projection. Like I said, the revenues outside of the tax levy mainly are flat. Then the expenditures, we have kind of a spreadsheet that we use, and Nicola gets to help me out with it, that we code certain line items in the budget to kind of be enveloped by a percentage. So like commodities, we have going up by like, let's say 3%, and health insurance lines go up by like 8%. And so we assign those codes to that. Then there's some items that are kind of wild cards where they don't follow a certain trend. And so we go through and we actually assign certain values to those, or maybe we have it go up one year and then we go back to the forecast code. So that's kind of how we do the expenditures. Then as far as the fund balance, we do have something scheduled into the general fund as far as a transfer out to the capital projects fund. I think the 22 and 23 budget years, we're talking about a $500,000 transfer, but we're also contemplating, because of our budget flexibility, that about $200,000 of that transfer is from the budget not coming in as or the actual not coming in as budget, so you have some flexibility as far as that flowing to the fund balance and then being used for capital projects. After 23, the transfer is projected to be like $300,000, so then the budget flexibility covers $200,000 of that, and $100,000 is, you'll see, is kind of chipping away at the fund balance. I got a dry throat, so I'm going to have to drink a lot here. So the next schedule just is our schedule of what percentages we used on those expenditure forecasting. So if you want to take a look at that in light reading, you can see what we used on those. And then this next page is really the projection. In the page that you have in front of you on the paper that I handed out, it's tiny, and probably, Ken, you're probably going to want it blown up or something, but it's definitely showing that we're using fund balance up at about $100,000 a year. Like I said, this is saying that we're actually have the ability to raise our tax levy to balance our budget for the most part, and that's not actually something that's really probably doable. The other thing that we have on here is, your assigned fund balance, unassigned fund balance is, I think is it 30% of your, help me out here, Nicola, it doesn't have it on here. What's your unassigned fund balance? Policy.
What's our policy, or
Yeah.
what's 20%?
20%.
20%, yeah. I thought that was on here, but I don't see it on the bottom. So what we try to identify is the second green bar from the bottom at least shows you how you are compared to that. And so we definitely have a healthy fund balance throughout the period. But like I said, that assumes that your tax levy is able to cover your expenditures for the most part.
I can just,
go ahead.
add something for clarity, and that is, so where we're going here with remembering that all of this is using the all-in version of the CIP plan, and so under the assumption is the gap, in order to be able to fund all of that CIP, would be raised through tax levy, and that's what Dave is just pointing out, is that it's not realistic to raise taxes by that amount, even if we weren't subject to levy limit, even if we had enough debt service exception to be able to tack on to the levy limit rule. But you will see that as we get a little bit further in here.
And this is just a graphical version of the general fund projection. You can see that we have, a fairly short fall of the other revenues. And then the expenditures and transfers out are the green bar. And then the property tax, which would be, like Nicholas said, is what we would need to fund to be able to have a balanced budget. And then there's that little bit of usage of fund balance to transfer to capital projects. It's the purple little blips down there at the bottom. I've given you a slide as far as what fund balance is about. If you have questions more about this, I could tell you a little bit more, but I think for time's sake, if you have questions on fund balances, we can get to that another time. And this is just another graphical breakout of how much is in each category of fund balance. So, the biggest fund balance item is your unassigned, and that's really your rainy day fund. And that's the one that you have a policy of 20%. And so right now you can see you're still pretty good. You're chipping away at it each year because of that transfer out. But all the other line items are basically staying the same. So, and then this demonstrates once again that 20% line. And because we're chipping away at it, you can see that that's a declining slope as far as that goes. And then, fund balance, as far as what you can use it for, obviously it's used for your working capital, your liquidity, your ability to pay your bills. If you have shortfalls or cost overruns, it gives you that way of doing that. It gives you the ability to pay emergency expenses, which are one-time expenses. You use it for future capital projects by moving it out to fund some of your capital projects. Those are one-time costs as well. You could use it to pay off debt or reduce your debt. And you can you can use it to fund limited duration programs or non-recurring expenditures. So I think if you hear anything that I'm saying about using your fund balance, always use it if you're going to use it and you have the capacity to do so on one-time items, because if you start to use it for your operations, you're going to get in trouble. So that you can't replace, if you have recurring things and you're using one-time money for it, eventually it's going to come back to haunt you. Levy limits, as we talked about, are definitely not fun things in the world of municipalities these days. You can only increase your levy typically by what's called net new construction, which is basically your new development less demolition. That's reported by your assessor to the Department of Revenue each year, and that's converted to a percentage, lands on your levy limit worksheet, and it's basically an amount that is relatively small. And actually, I think it's on the next page. It shows what your percentages have been. There are a bunch of adjustments that you can take on the levy limit worksheet, but most of them apply to somebody that had a problem somewhere in the state and are specific to those municipalities. There's a couple that you use. Adjustment E is where we can add our debt service levy onto. You'll see that it's an adjustment line that pops into the spreadsheet after the levy limit calculation. Otherwise, there isn't anything really that the city can take. The ones that are maybe available, the city does their levy limit worksheet properly and they don't have those things pop up. So, and the last thing, obviously, like I said before, there's no flexibility for inflation as far as levy limits. Your history of your net new construction, 2019 was a little over 0.5%. 2020, you were below 25%. You can see what the other percentages are. And you can see how much those amounts have added up to as far as how much you can increase your levy. So you can see it's almost nothing. And that's, that's harsh. In 2020, though, you did close a TIF, and so you were able to add another 35,000. So that's the other thing within the levy limit calculation that does give you a little bit of flexibility as the years that you close TIFs. And so TIF 5, if it closes in 2025, is something that'll give you a little bit of extra pop that year. So as far as the things that are subject to levy limits, your operating, so the general fund and the transit and those kind of things are subject to levy limits. Your capital projects levy, if you have one, is subject to levy limits. And then your geo debt service payments are outside of the levy limit calculation. So when you do your calculation, you get to add on to your base levy for that new construction. Then you have the ability to take that total and add how much you need to levy for the debt service. So that's how your levy limit is actually calculated. And then as far as the all-in graph, so this one looks a little crazy, but really, if you looked at the capital projects fund that I showed you earlier, the levy for the capital project fund is really bouncing all around. And, we typically have a recommendation that says that you should have a smooth levy in that. And I think you'll see when I show you alternative 1, which ends up being a smooth levy of 0, that you can see that bounce doesn't exist. But otherwise, you can see that there's quite a bit of zigzagging, and that's really related to what's happening in the capital projects levy in the all-in version. But, the blue section is really that operating section that it can only go up by net new construction. Then that green and red that's in there, that's all solid colors. That's really the amount of debt adjustment that you can do. That's a maximum amount of your geo debt payments. And then based on this version of the all-in, we actually have to use what's called abated debt to be able to pay for some of the year's tax levies. And what abated debt means is that we actually can put a levy onto the adjustment E and add to our levy using debt payments that are actually in the TIF. We're still collecting money for that TIF, but you do have the ability, I wouldn't encourage this unless you're really desperate, but you do have the ability to levy for that, even though it's paid for by a different things, because it gives you the ability to pay for one-time items as well. Now, there is a little bit of a black area on here, and that means that we didn't have enough abated debt to pay for that year. So that's one thing that we were outside of, like, the maximum amount you could levy that year. And then the next schedule is just the tax levy and how it works. And as you can see, as I talked about on the last one, the capital projects really bouncing around from 100,000 to 1.5 million really demonstrates on the graphs below why there's such a variance. And so when I I'm going to jump a couple slides here to the alternatives. So this is really, so I'm back on page 43. And so in this case, we have, this year we're going to have $100,000 of property taxes, and then we aren't going to have any property taxes in the capital fund anymore. And then the other thing that is different in this version of the CIP is that we're borrowing based on that practice of only borrowing as much as how much we paid off the prior year. So that's really the big change here. And what it ends up showing is that, we don't have enough funding in this version to be able to take on all the projects. So in that case, if you're still following your practice, obviously you would have an alternative CIP for the next year so that you'd be able to fit those in, and that's probably part of your plan. Same graph as I showed you before that shows, where we're funded with the green as far as revenues, and then the red is the borrowing that is coming in because we didn't have a levy in this version of the alternatives. The next schedule is really the sizing sheet that we talked about before, but this is we only borrow as much as we paid off. And so this schedule works backwards to determine how much we can do in project costs. So those dollar amounts, taking into the issuance costs that kind of eat into how much we have, it gives you that project number, which is actually the top line. So then as far as the debt, the impact of the taxes on that debt, same thing as before. The left side is that earlier base case that I had. The pink part is really how we pay for those 5 years of debt based on that practice that we only borrow how much we paid off. You can see that we have shorter amount of years if you compare the two. We're able to pay off that debt a little faster because, like I said, I'm trying to at least have $100,000 maturities. So in most cases, when we're borrowing about $1.3 million, we're paying them off in about 13 or 14 years. So that shortens it up. It's a lot less money as far as total cost because we're not doing as much projects, obviously. And so our tax rate actually is about 9 cents lower on that lowest amount of tax rate at an equalized, and that says 1%, but I think it's at 0.25%. So that heading is wrong on that one. It's at the 0.25%. And then also I showed you what happens when there's 3% growth as well, although I think there's a little goofy stuff going on in that 2026 number. So that should be flowing down like that last schedule did. And then this graph really looks the same as the last one. We're trying to have a stable tax rate. And you can see that the tax rate is holding steady at that 231. And then like I said before, on the total taxes that we collect for this is that, we have that little bump up in 2025 because of the TIF 5 closure. As far as the debt capacity, you can see we're paying off a little bit faster because we aren't borrowing quite as much. So, at the end of 2027, we're about 46%. I think on the other one, we were still around 50. And then as far as the levy limit projection, we actually don't end up, we end up using what we have available for levy limit. We don't exceed the levy limit using this version until we get to about 2026 where we use a little bit of abated debt. It's just a real sliver there. But for the most part, this plan with the existing debt practice and the way that we had the levy being projected is we were able to basically cover our services in this version without having to exceed that green bar up there. And then this the overall picture again. Really we have a little bit flatter picture than we did with the last one because that capital projects levy was really bouncing. As you can see in the brown column for capital projects, we don't have a levy. Basically, we were trying to do like we did last year. We had what happens if the tax rate goes up 3%, and we couldn't get that to work. We would add negative numbers in the capital projects. So the route we took is to not have a capital projects levy, which is what happens in a lot of places when we have levy limits affecting us. Is that that's the first place that goes to help fund the general fund. So then I'm going to jump back to some of the comments and recommendations, if I can find what the heck that is in here. I promise I'm pretty close to being done. Much paper. All right, so let's go back.
Page 39.
So as far as some of the things that we have comments about or possible future actions that you could potentially take, the comments that we have really is we talked about inflation is going to put a lot of pressure on your levy limit. You need, as that becomes an issue, you're going to need to start looking for ways to maybe fix that. So some of the things that are out there for you to do if levy limits start to get really, keep you from doing what you need to do. Things you can do is, deep dive into your operating funds budgets. And this might not be the thing you want to hear, but sometimes that budget flexibility is where some of it needs to go. You know, if you've got contingency accounts or you've got fluff in some budgets they're there every year, you know, maybe those are things that you're able to take out. Other additional revenues, you have a wheel tax. You could contemplate increasing that. There's other fees that are like what's called a street light electric bill recovery charge that you could put into place. Really, it's something that you determine like a unit charge on, you know, either it's like in the places that I've helped, it's a residence is like 1 unit. And the way that they're pretty simple, where anything that's not a residential unit, which I think is like more than 4, like a 4-plex, is 2 units. So they divide the street utility expense that the general fund pays by those units, and they recover that through the utility bill. And it's a way to basically provide another revenue source before you have to do more drastic things. You know, the other thing is you know, what are your services? If it gets really desperate, what are your services, and what are residents willing to maybe forgo? That's not a really fun thing to have to do, but if there's things that's funded by the levy that you could cut back on or eliminate, that might be a place to go to. And then the last ditch effort, which actually is becoming more popular these days, is levy limit referendums. And I think Brian was here with me the other day, and he has actually done a few of the levy limit referendums, and they're coming in more and more these days. You get your best kick at the can when it's public safety or maybe public works. Unfortunately, they don't. Referendums don't pass when you have like your general government or your city hall people as your reason doing it, and that's unfortunate because that's probably where you need some of your rates for your pay to go. But if you're going to hang your hat on a levy limit referendum, those are the visual things to your residents that are probably something that if you had to go that way that you would focus on. And then as far as the other things, you know, you're obviously using your unassigned fund balance to help your capital. As long as you have that available, that's something that's really good. We just got to make sure we don't get to a point where it may hurt our bond rating by showing that we're actually losing liquidity or reserves. You know, the one thing that I don't believe is in your fund balance policy, but is something that, you know, what can be done when you have that fund balance excess. It's something that can be added to it. You know, one thing that it would be really good to state in there is that they can only be used for one-time things. And I think that's an important thing that as far as the expenditure restraint, the staff isn't worried about this one at this point, but the one thing that if you don't qualify some year and that revenue's in the general fund, it creates a hole. So if you have a way to move that to the capital projects fund and you know, and if you don't qualify in a year that it's in the capital projects fund, you always have funding sources such as debt to do some of your projects. So it's something that just takes away that one possible hole that you'll hit in some year where you don't qualify. And you're doing a great job with your economic development. I mean, I was just at the New Quick trip on the way in here. So, you know, things are happening here. I think that's a really big thing. The more you keep pushing your economic development, the more it's going to help you increase taxes. It gives you, you know, give you some growth there to spread the taxes across. And then, as you probably already do, you know, review your policies and make sure they make sense, or your practices, and make sure what we're doing is making sense, or is it time for an adjustment? And then, of course, I think that I even heard it when Adam was talking about the staffing plan is, you know, long-range planning is a big deal, especially now because we need to be able to identify when we're having problems long before we get to that date. So it's something that you should, you know, kudos to you that you're doing and continue to do so. I think, do you want me to go through the TIF?
Sure, if you can just go through.
I was going to say, I mean, it really, it's just those those statements on here. So, I mean, if you have questions on the TIF, I think, you know, the one thing that, you know, I can point out is TIF 5 obviously shows a yellow bar on the 2025 showing that we have a potential of closing that TIF then. TIF 6 is the one that we've had a little bit of struggle with, and there will be some hopefully some development that'll help cure that, and maybe it won't have to stay up until 31. And I think staff has some alternatives to that, turning into advances, like that big red cumulative column says. We don't want to have that be an advance from the general fund because that hurts our liquidity. So I think staff has some ideas on how they're going to address that and not let that cumulative column turn into a big red $1 million amounts. Anything you wanted to say on that one? Because that was kind of the big one there.
Sure. So, we did get some advice from our bond counsel, our debt counsel, Qualls and Brady, and since the TID 6 was extended by 6 years, so we did see some growth. We didn't get Cummins. Cummins is not coming. So that did impact TID 6. We had thought that would make TID 6 not even be on the radar as a potential concern anymore. But then when that project didn't occur due to COVID impacts, we have been looking closely at TID 6. But those two extensions, adding 6 years to the life of the TID, has given us enough time, combined with the economic growth in the TID, that the TID is now projected to cover all of its project costs through the end of its life. And why that is important is because if it doesn't cover its projected costs, then we, the city, are on the hook to cover those costs. However, as Dave was just pointing out, there are some years between now and the end of TID 6's life where there will be significant deficit from year to year. And one way to handle that would be through some advances from the general fund. But again, as Dave indicated, that sucks up our unassigned fund balance, which is our reserves, which is where we go when we need some funds for CIP. So instead, what we can do is we can use one of several debt vehicles. We can do a short-term borrow for a few years to fund the TIF until it gets to the years where it has plenty of excess, and so then that borrow could be paid off. We could look at refinancing a current bond that is in the TIF so that it stretches out those payments over a longer period. So there's a couple of different things that we're going to be bringing to the council as different options in order to avoid having to advance from the general fund during those interim years.
Then the last TIF that we have in here is really the TIF 7. That's actually doing quite well. For the most part, the annual amounts are positive, and we don't really have much of a deficit in this one. That basically, by the end of 23, according to the projection, you would actually have enough that you'll be in the positive at that point, and you'll be paying off your projects easily and being able to basically cover your obligations in the year 2032 and be able to call the rest of the debt that's outstanding at that point.
And I just wanted to, on that one as well, is draw the council's attention to the fact that TID 5, Walmart, Menards, Keystone Development that's our high-flying TID, and it's creating a lot of value in those TID parcels. And then there was an arrangement made whereby TID 5 was sharing its excess increment, with TID 7 to help TID 7 have good performance and be able to cover its project costs by the end of its life. Now, if we didn't have that relationship, TID 7 would not be looking so healthy. It would look like it was not going to cover all of its project costs. What we have coming up here in these next few years is TID 5 is currently projected to close in 2025, and that will help our 2026 budget for the city. Something that Adam and I have talked about is, we can look at, we don't have much time, but next year, based on, our final assessed value from the state and some other things that come through next year, we could look at what would be the impact if we closed TID 5 a year earlier. That would bring up the total city assessed value, but we would also have that risk is we would lose almost $1 million of increment in TID 7, $500,000, So would TID 7 be projected still to close in the black if we did that? And, you know, we would try to do some projections with the help of our municipal advisor to figure out what would be the risk of closing TID 5 a year earlier, which would help our budget, but that might hit us, 10 years from now when TID 7 closes. So there'd be a little bit of risk in there, but that'd be something we'd want to look at.
And we did project out how much that like hit to the or the levy limit worksheet would be, and it's about $117,000, $120,000 of new revenues that you would have because if it happened in 2025. So, with and we're using the values right now as far as those numbers when we're projecting it. So that's probably pretty close if you moved it up a year as well. So, I mean, we went through the TIFs really fast, and I'm happy to go through because there's a bunch of words in here that describes exactly what Nicholas said about the sharing agreement, which obviously is very beneficial to TIF 7. And has helped that TIF turn around. So, I mean, I did talk a little bit about, and I wish I had in here how much I had for projects, and maybe I'll email Adam and Nicola tomorrow, but I had put together basically a graph of what we could actually add to projects to be able to kind of ride a certain line of debt or debt capacity, and I think it was about 2.7 million in projects that we'd be able to do and be able to ride about, that we get about 70% of our self-imposed, which means you could probably go up a little bit and ride the line otherwise. But what comes with adding obviously about $1.4 million in debt payments or debt levy or debt issuance, is that your tax rate would go up too. So I mean, there's a little bit of a balance, but you do have that capacity that we once were really scraping for, and so I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that there's lots of improvement that are going on with the capacity, but it comes with the price of paying for it too. So
yeah. And then as a final note, if I would just have you look back at that page 50 in the original presentation, which is alternative 1, and that is the one that has the various colors, and those colors, you've got a blue, and then you've got kind of a tan and a yellow and a red and a green and then a purple. And essentially, what going through this process with Dave was able to show me and Adam is that, in that alternative 1, so now we're not looking at doing all of CIP. We're kind of reversing how we're looking at it and saying, well, what if we wanted our tax rate increases to be somewhat reasonable? And when I say that, I realize that a 0% tax increase would be ideal, but especially in our current environment with inflation, maybe a 3 to 4% increase might be something that's more realistic. Then that slide on that page 50 is kind of showing you with what are actually very on those forecast codes of how costs are going to increase. They are very conservative based on 2022. It's assuming that inflation comes down. If inflation doesn't come down, then even this slide is not realistic. But the operations costs are reflective of those 2%, 3% increases in costs. And then, a taxi bus levy is the $45,000, which also I think Howard would tell you is not currently realistic. And then the debt that we've already borrowed is in what's in red. So that's the debt service being covered there. And then the green column would be the new debt if we comply with our practice of only borrowing what we paid off in levy-supported principal the prior year. And so all of those together, without anything for tax levy for capital projects, still yields a tax rate that's increasing by more than 3% a year over the next 5 years. So it's very sobering, and that's why Dave was talking about what are some things that we could think about doing in terms of, being able to address that. Obviously, it's not realistic to not do any capital projects either, because that's where we're replacing our snow plows and our trucks and things like, and our roads and things like that, so.
Well, we've thrown a lot at you. Do you have questions for either myself or staff? You know, I think one of the things that we didn't really touch on is that you're in compliance with your policies, you know, whether it's fund balance or if it's the debt policies. So I think, you know, as far as what is set up, your financial management plan demonstrates that you're within those policies at this point. So. Now it's a matter of how you keep them there.
In a climate like we're in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody with any specific questions of Dave? That's a lot of pages.
It is.
It is a lot of pages.
I have a cohort that did a speech for some group that he had to do a slide every 15 or 30 seconds. I can't remember what it was. And I was like, well, it's still been half an hour. What did I do?
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried to go fast. I tried to skip stuff. It's just one of those things that there's a lot of information.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we see this, and thank you. And thank you for, I'm sure it's even more valuable for them than it is for us to have this, so, yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, well, this is not something we adopt or don't adopt, so I think we then hear all about the financial management plan just before we hear about the budget, which is probably a good thing. So Adam, on to the budget,
All right, on to the budget.
or
So
the proposed budget, I guess.
yes, so this is obviously the first draft of kind of everything that has been encompassed. So kind of hitting the central theme that we've been talking about tonight. So obviously we like to kind of have a quote or a goal within our budget. And I think Barb has mentioned this a couple of times, and we've talked about plan and planning. So this is, our goals can only be reached through a vehicle of a plan in which we must fervently believe and upon which we must vigorously act. There is no other route to success. So just kind of looking through the budgetary timeline. So again, we're on Tuesday, October 11th. So this is kind of the first presentation to the council of our draft budget and where things are looking at. Tomorrow, we're going to have the Water and Sewer Commission. We'll be asking them to approve the 2023 utility budget. Then next week is going to kind of be the deep dive opportunity where each council member will have the opportunity to ask any specific line item questions that they would want, or talk about specific if they want to shift anything around as far as funding. Then potentially, we have not done this historically, but Tuesday, October 25th, if needed, we would be able to have something on there for the budget. We're hoping we don't have to go that route, so hopefully we can get everything ironed out on the 18th and then kind of be good. Then on October 27th, we basically submit the public notice for the budget. We then issue the releases. On Monday, November 14th, we have the official city manager presentation of kind of the finalized budget. And then on Tuesday, November 22nd, we have the public hearing where we then ask the council to actually adopt the budget. So just quickly, what we're going to go over are just basically some budget basics, do a very brief overview of where 2022 kind of had review, look at the financial outlook and considerations, and then kind of get into the nitty gritty of the high level overview of the 2023 city manager budget. So again, just budget basics. So again, the city must create a budget where revenues equal expenditures. So as you can see here, we have borrowing, revenues are borrowing, state aid, fees, and taxes. Our expenditures then are operating expenses, capital spending, debt, and TID shortfalls. So then again, budget basic expenditures, we talk about the operating budget. That's the basis costs to run the day-to-day operations. Our CIP is our one-time cost for large capital items. And then our debt service is our repayments on our loans. And then our TID districts are if the revenues are less than the expenses. As we talked about, the shortfall may need to be covered. So again, our operating revenues, kind of the rules are one-time revenues should not be used to balance the operating budget. So there's two options to kind of balance the budget, increase revenue or decrease expenses. So then we have some personal kind of equivalent examples here. Your monthly pay must cover your ongoing personal expenses. So using one-time revenue to balance your budget is like winning $500 in the lottery or leasing a car with a monthly payment of $500. You can cover the expense for a month, but you will not be able to cover the expense next month unless you win the lottery again. So just kind of considering if we do those things, we have to be able to plan that in the future. So we'll talk about that later. Debt service. So again, the city borrows money to pay for large, long life capital projects such as streets. The length of a loan should not exceed beyond the useful life of the item for which the funds were borrowed. Payments on loans represent the city's debt service, so caps in the amount of the city can borrow exist. The state has a 5% limit of equalized value, and the city policy is 3.5%. So one of the things we are seeing, obviously, with the reassessment is our equalized value has definitely gone up. So last year, when we were kind of looking at numbers with our principal outstanding, we were looking at about a 53.8% in regards to how much debt capacity we have. We're now at 45.6. So that is one of the positives, obviously, we have seen with the reassessment is our ability to borrow is obviously increased. Same thing with our city debt limit policy, looking at the equalized value times 3.5%. That comes to about 29 million is what we could borrow. Our current principal outstanding is estimated to be at about 19.4. We're at about 65.2% of our 3.5, whereas previously last year we were at 76.9. So that definitely is good. Just going to kind of into the CIP funding, we talked about this last week when we did our work session. There's really kind of a couple of different avenues in regards to funding sources. You've got the transfer from the general fund, carryover and funding from previous years, doing short-term borrowing, using revenue, and then kind of long-term borrowings as well. So due to the budgetary concerns, our best estimate is that the city conservatively has available $537,075 to spend on predictable CIP items. These items include vehicle replacement, equipment replacements, building repair, park improvements, sidewalk repair. In addition, the city has borrowed from $1 to $2 million for street reconstruction annually. Under the current long-range financial plan, the city has limited this borrowing to the amount being retired each year. So again, in 2022, the anticipated principal paid off for levy-supported financial borrowing is $1,355,000. Just talking briefly about the TIF districts. Again, TIF districts are separate funds that have their own revenue and expenses. If revenues exceed expenses, the amount goes into the fund balance for the district for future expenses. The TIF district may close early and the created tax base is added to the rest of the city. Obviously, if the expenses exceed revenues and there isn't fund balance, that's what we just talked about in the financial management plan, that we may have to cover the shortfall. So this information is pulled directly out of our 2022 budget book. So when we get into kind of the nitty gritty next week, you'll actually see the 2021 finalized numbers. I know one of the questions that Barb had, which was a good one, was it talks in here about anticipated. That's why there's the difference. This just kind of pulls it out of there so you can kind of see where historically we have been in regards to the equalized tax rate comparisons in previous years. This just again kind of shows you the different graph and some of our kind of key municipalities and comparisons. We then go into a little bit of detail of what was in the budget book. So as you can see here for total government revenues, as was kind of talked about, we are still heavily reliant on, or I guess, property taxes and intergovernmental revenues are really what makes the majority of our revenues coming in. So we continue to be reliant on having to have property taxes in order to cover the majority of our operational revenue, and as well as the intergovernmental revenues, which is our state aid, municipal aids, and transportation aids. Then, slide here. Then this just kind of shows you again some of the areas. Another graph shows the property taxes, intergovernmental revenues, again with the general fund. We do have some public charges for services, interest revenue, and some assessments, permits, etc. This then just kind of gives you a little bit of a breakdown. You can see in 2020 our adopted budget for the general fund was about $8.7 million. That was a 4.4% estimated increase over the prior year. The taxi bus fund is about $644,000. Our debt service was at about $1.6 million. The capital project fund for 2022 was adopted at $3.5. Then we have our TIF districts kind of showing the different revenues that were in there. TIF 5 was about $929,000. TID 6 is about $603,000, and TID 7 is $1.7 million. And then some of our other funds, we have a redevelopment authority, our affordable housing, and then obviously the Broski Events Center. This just kind of shows you general government expenditures for 2022 in the budgetary review. As you can see, the majority of our funds are, again, capital project fund levy and then public safety. Those tend to be our two most expenditures. And then we have obviously the sprinkling of all of our other ones in regards to our other departments and debt service. So then looking primarily at the general fund, our two big areas, again, are public safety and public works that make up the majority of our general fund expenses. And then everything else kind of rounds it out. This just kind of provides you a brief overview of where everything was in regards to the general fund expenditures. So we had general government, public safety, public works, Health and Human Services, again, to make up that total of 8.7. So the revenue coming in, equals the expenditures going out. And then this also provides you with some of the other funds, the taxi bus, debt service, capital projects, and TIF. All right, so looking at kind of the financial outlooks and considerations. So again, using projections for operational needs, anticipated borrowing, and CIP spending, the long-range financial plan provided a look at the financial factors influencing the next 5 years. Again, we are continuing to see that the increase in operational expenses due to inflation are expected to outpace our net new construction. It's anticipated TID 6 will no longer require levy support due to projected growth and the approval of the 6-year extension. So as you can see here, as we talked about, our net new construction here this year was 0.42%. That equated to about $3.2 million of growth. This is some of the comparisons you can see as our municipal peers. The town of Platteville was 0.62, Lancaster was 2.3, Belmont was 1.1, Whitewater was 2.6, River Falls was 2.7, and Baraboo was 1.15. We're looking again at trying to sustain about $537,000 of annual support for CIP. Our TID and citywide growth and or increases in state funding would obviously help with the above. And city funding support for a new fire facility will need to be monitored in 2023 and 2024 due to the debt service requirements that we talked about. So as we look into the 2023, obviously, city manager budget, a lot of the budgetary drivers that we look at in regards to operational expenses are salaries, benefits, mandates that we have to follow, elections, contracts. Revenues that we looked at are obviously state aids, hotel tax, revenue related to new development, and then our other are obviously our debt services, kid support, and expenditure restraint. So it's been the central theme, as we've kind of talked about in 2022, which really played a factor into this proposed budget, is obviously our historical CPI versus wage performance. So as you can see, from 2026 to 2022, we've averaged about 3.59% in regards to CPI. But really, as you can see, in 2021 and 2022 are the heavy hitters. We've seen almost a 15% increase in CPI against our wages, which historically we've been at, as you can see, about 1% to 2%. So we've been averaging about 3.59 in CPI and 1.14 in wages, and then our step increases. Unfortunately, due to our budgetary issue, we really in 2022 was the first year we were able to provide an increase in the step plan. So that's something that we definitely want to continue to look at in order to continue to be competitive. The next thing that we looked at as well was in regards to the kind of where our municipal peers are looking at wage increases for this year. So this is information I pulled directly off of the Wisconsin City Managers Association website, is looking at kind of populations and where they were. And as you can see, they run the gamut with anywhere between 8%, 4%, 5%, 2%. What this essentially came to is, after looking at all of these municipal peers and averaging it out, it came to a municipal average of 5% is what our municipal peers are kind of looking at in regards to trying to propose wage increases in their budgets. So what this particular budget is proposing, essentially for 2023, is a 5% wage increase for all non-union city staff members except the city manager position. So that obviously is something that you guys as the council have to make a determination on in regards to mine, because I'm a contracted employee. So that is something that we'll have to consider in the next meetings, kind of determining what you want to do with that. So that is not in here. The city manager position right now is flat. So the impact to the budget is approximately $123,000 for that. A proposed Wisconsin Professional Police Association wage increase of 5% to align with the compensation plan, and impacts to the budget is approximately $45,000. And then continuing to do step increases for all eligible employees in recognition of honoring the 2016 City of Platteville compensation plan. That has an impact to the budget of approximately $14,000. Also looking in here then is the proposal to contract with Southwestern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission to provide geographic information system mapping services. This is an impact to the budget of $20,000. Then what happens there is the proposed implementation of year one of the long-term staffing analysis increases for the identified staffing positions. This is an impact to the budget, will be absorbed by $65,000 reduction of the position we just talked about being contracted, and then looking at increases to the museum revenue for store sales and new exhibits. What is also in this budget then is obviously proposed increases to the expenditure line items impacted by inflation. So we're looking at gas, utilities, supplies, etc. Then obviously some of the possible decreases and increases are reviewing other municipal fee charges increases to increase the revenue potentials and decrease the levy. So that's something we can continue to look at in this budget. Obviously, then review other reductions if recommended by the Common Council. There are still 2 items that we are kind of waiting on in regards to this budget. So property liability insurance renewals and finalized statement of assessment. So you are seeing some changes in this slide versus the presentation that you got, because we did get some information on the transportation aids, which we'll talk about here in a bit. So some of the increases, obviously, we are seeing that are greater than $10,000. Our health insurance increases are $90,000. So one of the things we are already actively looking at in 2023 is doing a deep dive into our health insurance and kind of looking at some potential opportunities. What we've seen in the past 2 years has been about an 8% increase each year in our health insurance costs. So that is something that staff is already anticipating we are going to be looking at in regards to how we can tackle that. Is there different plans that we can look at, different options that we can provide? Obviously, that's something we want to be very cognizant of with our employees, is their health insurance. So those are things we're going to be looking at, where if we continue to see that type of an increase, we're going to have some conversations about what that means. Obviously, we have the step increases for eligible employees, the 5% increases for both the police officers and non-union employees, the implementation of the staff plan, property and liability insurance estimate increases of about $17,000. Local room tax contribution, we are obviously anticipating an increase in that, but there's a flip side to that, is there's obviously then more revenue that's going to be coming in. So that we'll get to in a second. We have some interest on our long-term debt that's increasing, street maintenance, equipment repair, and then obviously our GIS contracted services. So then some decreases that we're obviously anticipating then is the GIS specialist to offset that. That's about $79,000. One of the decisions that we made here is we historically in the budget have had a unfilled police officer position, or had a 21st police officer. In order to be able to try to obviously increase the wages for our staff, we're potentially looking at not filling that position and reducing that in the budget. So that's about $88,000 right there. We then have our election. We're anticipating seeing some reductions there, because obviously with less, we're not having the gubernatorial, we're not having that. We're seeing some decreases there. So that came to about $179,000. Then looking at some operational revenue increases, as we said, the flip side of that coin, when we're seeing about $45,000 in increase in expense, we are anticipating about $75,000 in local room tax. That is directly in the fact of, with COVID kind of no longer having restrictions, we're starting to see increases obviously in our hotels, and also the potential reopening again of the hotel, the Cobblestone Inn and Suites, we're anticipating there. We're also anticipating with rising interest costs that is going to play the benefit in our funding, seeing some additional with our funds being in the bank, seeing some interest there. Then we have the sale of the street department items at about $10,000, and also we're anticipating about $25,000 in county library funding increases. Then, unfortunately, some of the decreases we're seeing is kind of the long-term conversations that we've been having. Unfortunately, we are seeing a state aid municipal service payment reduction. That is directly related to potentially an audit that was done this year, and where they determined that there were some municipalities that their police factor was at 0.7. We were included in that list, and everybody else was at 0.5. So they essentially wanted to make everything kind of streamlined and the same. So that unfortunately caused a $54,000 reduction in our state aid municipal service payment. And as we've talked about, with every about 47 to 48, that's an automatic 1% increase that we're seeing in the tax rate. Municipal owned utility payments, we're seeing some of that reduction, and that is also in regards to with our utilities that fluctuates from year to year. OE grade building rent, obviously with the fact of looking at potentially the new fire station being located there, we did have some organizations make the determination to move elsewhere. So we're anticipating that reduction, but then also we may see some reductions then obviously in utility expenses. So that could offset itself. General transportation aids is the new one that we just received basically on Friday. Unfortunately, this is the long-term conversation that we continue to have, and one we're going to be continually lobbying with the League of Municipalities, is with the inability of being able to fund our roads and having to look at reducing our capital improvement planning and our debt. That then has a effect on the amount of transportation aids that we receive. It's a rolling 6-year average. So as we've talked about in the last 6 years, we have typically reduced the amount of borrowing that we've done based on our numbers. And a lot of that has been because of the requirements that we've had to do in order to fund operations. So because of that, unfortunately, we are continuing to see a reduction in our general transportation aids. Going into our CIP, I did make some recommendation tweaks based on the work session that we had. So what you can see here is if you look specifically in the general obligation debt section, there were some concerns about funding anything that was about $10,000. So that has been shifted. So as you can see, what we did here is we made some changes to have what is truly general obligation debt be a specific projects that were either, $25,000 or more. And then what we did is looked at shifting some projects around and how we could fund that either with reserves or potentially the levy. So here are kind of the recommended breakdown of the projects. We're looking at kind of from the general government side, doing our renovations to kind of the City Hall Phase 3, which are the 2 office areas on the bottom. Having our general obligation debt cover our City Hall elevator control boards, our IT infrastructure improvements being funded by reserve, the incubator parking lot being funded by TIF funds, our portable radios being funded by general fund reserves, and then our radio system upgrade being split between general fund reserves, and then the rest of it being general obligation debt. Our radio repeater then also being funded by debt, our street repair and maintenance being funded by the wheel tax, then a couple of items with highway striping, sidewalk repair being funded by our general fund reserve. Alleys potentially reducing the amount that we would fund to that. So the request was 30, looking at funding about $20,000 towards that. Then particularly from the DPW side, doing about 2.5 dump truck, having that be general obligation debt, our trail maintenance coming from reserves. And then the one street project we are going to be looking at doing next year is the Jefferson Street reconstruction, because that was was on our CIP plan. So looking at having that capped at $600,000 and then doing the same thing in the water and sewer, which you'll see here in a second. And then breaking down then the other projects specifically from DPW with the mowers, the street garage being broken out a little bit between general fund reserves and then general obligation debt, our sidewalks being covered by TIF funds, then the non-motorized comp plan being covered by reserves and grants, the Fastenal storm sewer being covered by capital projects reserve, and then the other three or four projects here with the forklift, tire machine, paint machine, and the Bryan tank trailer being funded by general fund reserves. Then looking at parks, specifically having the mowers covered by capital project levy, then the silo shelter being a combination of grant funds and trust, looking at an electronic access fence for our dump site being funded by general obligation debt, and then our pool hot water heater being funded by general fund reserves, and then using some surplus of ARPA and CIP funds being for security cameras coming from $50,000 for other to look at park improvements for cameras in 2023. Our library then is being funded by a split between the library foundation and our general fund reserves. Then we have 2 or 3 projects here specifically from the museum, looking at long-term parking and the potential acquisition of a property being funded by general obligation debt, the energy audit being funded by a grant, and then our rock school improvements being funded by general fund reserve. Our fire department having their radios being funded by general fund reserve. The fire station essentially is a grant or the appropriation that we're getting, going again for a grant for our fire air packs, and then the radio repeater being covered by general obligation debt. Then our taxi essentially being covered by a combination of grants, and then also the request from the university to fund the bus in basically with the federal government funding the rest there. And then our airport having a CIP match of $15,000. So what this kind of breaks down is the CIP, not for the water and sewer side, that's separate, but looking at having 1.3 million being a breakdown of essentially 20-year bond being about almost $1 million, and then our 10-year note being funded to cover the rest to get to the 1.3. Looking at about $100,000 being utilized in capital project levy for the CIP, about $437,000 in reserves, using $135,000 in TIF, our wheel tax, about $7.6 million in grants and other trust and funding sources, and then using other funding sources, either cash that we had on hand or potentially getting cash from other sources to fund the rest. This then is our water and sewer budget, and so potentially everything that was requested is being funded. The only tweak really that we made here was in regards to the Jefferson Street reconstruction. We put that project back in and put that at a cap of $600,000, essentially being split between water revenue bonds and sewer revenue bonds. But then this has the rest of our water and sewer CIP being funded either by water revenue bonds or sewer bonds, and then cash on hand for a total of about $2.3 million, with about $494,000 being covered by water revenue bonds, $1.8 million being covered by sewer bonds, and then $60,000 by cash on hand. What that meant then is obviously there were projects that we were unable to fund. That came to a total of about $792,000. As you can see here, our police department made the decision that we would delay funding a squad car in order to be able to fund some of the other projects that they felt were higher priority. Some of our facility contingency funds, as kind of Dave alluded to, when you have to make some tough decisions, those are some of the funds we look to potentially not budget for in future years. There were then some street projects that potentially did not get funded, and that was directly related to the grants that we tried to go after. So this does not mean that we didn't want to do those projects, but essentially we were kind of banking on the bills and potential funding from the federal government. Since we did not get those funded, potentially we made the decision to not fund those particular streets and kept Jefferson, which was one of our high priority streets, in there. We're not looking at replacing one of our snow blowers and essentially delaying that project into future years. The Jackson Street curb was another one we looked at delaying till potentially future years. Our Parks Department made the decision on the same thing with a pickup truck, delaying that and looking at some other projects that potentially we will try to do in future years. Same thing with the museum, delaying any improvements to the Hammer Robbins building. And then our fire department looking at potentially some contingency funds. So where our potential budget looks at right now is an overall 6% increase in the levy. So the general fund is looking to increase about 15%. Our taxi bus fund, we're going to be utilizing reserve in order to cover that. So that's why you're seeing a reduction there. We have reserve funding from COVID and a lot of the money there that we're going to utilize for that. Our debt service fund is anticipated to increase about 3.1%. Our CIP is looking at about $100,000, so that's about a reduction of about 49% there. And then we are anticipating having to use ARPA funds to cover some of this. So we have $75,000 that we are estimating to use. And what we're looking at, as we kind of talked about in this conversation, in future years, you don't want to use one-time debt. So as we talked about with potentially having to change our insurance, that's where we're kind of already banking on covering that deficit for next year, is we feel that by making some changes either to our insurance, we can make up that $75,000 there. So what this potentially looks at doing is with a 6%, this is where we get into the evaluation, obviously, or the reevaluation that occurred. So there's the potential that homeowners could see a multitude of options this year that we unfortunately cannot put into speculation. What is happening is because of the reassessment, right now our tax rate is at $8.27. We are potentially looking at a reduction in our mill rate to go down to $7.31. So if a homeowner did not see a change in their assessed value, they will actually see a reduction on their tax bill, whether that would be commercial or residential. So what we tried to do is showcase if nothing changed in somebody's assessed value, potentially they're looking at anywhere from $144 to $384. What we then tried to anticipate is what would happen as we looked across the board. There was about the potential for a 20% reevaluation that a property owner could see their property increase by. Now that's going to fluctuate because that could be all across the board. From the commercial side, we saw about 13% increase in reevaluation. From the residential side was anywhere from 20 to about 23. So again, this is kind of a variable. So when you put those numbers together, it comes to an overall city reevaluation of about 20%. So what we looked at then is potentially with where the budget stands right now, if your home went from either 150 and you saw a 20% reevaluation, that would put you at $180,000 is what your property would be valued at. And that would essentially equate to a 75% increase that you would see in your taxes based on that reevaluation. And then obviously it scales up. So potentially then what that comes to is the monthly increases right now of anywhere, if you have 180 home to 480, you would be looking at about $6 a month to $16 a month, and anywhere from $75 to $200 if you saw a 20% increase in your property values. One of the things to consider is this is based on the assessed rate right now that we have been given. That assessed rate is not finalized by the state until November. So that is something that this is always an estimated assessment right now. So again, just looking at kind of history, We are looking at $7.31. Where that historically has been is that would put us back to where we saw tax numbers in about 2013 or 2014, where in 2013 we were $7.27 per $100,000 of assessed value. So that's kind of the quick version of everything that you see in here. What's going to happen next is our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, October 18th at 6 p.m. I think it's either 6 p.m. or 5 p.m. I'll have to double check that. I think it's 6. So what we're going to do there is that will be the opportunity for you to see each individual line item for obviously all the departments. And we can kind of discuss in a little bit more detail some of the rationale of why we chose to budget things a certain way, where we're seeing some increases, why we kept things where they are. But that is basically the draft version as it stands right now.
Questions or comments? Okay, so Adam, the line item budgets by department will be, when will we get those? Not just that night.
No, so we will try to get that obviously to you before the end of this week so that you have the weekend to obviously look at it, and then in preparation for that.
Yeah, because going through those can be very tedious. So
Right.
I'm hoping people will look and come with their questions. So that means having it in advance.
Motion to adjourn if.
There you go. I was like, I don't think there's much else that we can say here. So Todd has offered a motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
And Kathy has seconded it. Candace will vote.
Killian,
Yes.
Nichols,
Yes.
Cop,
Yes.
Arts,
Yes.
Parrot,
Yeah.
Casper,
Yes.
Doss.
Yes.
Motion carries.